Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us in the forum and then also for this exciting portion, which will be the presidential address. But before we get started on that, I just wanted to give some administrative remarks. The first one is those people that are joining over Zoom, we are offering simultaneous interpretation. All you have to do is click on the globe icon on the bottom of the screen. Para los que están atendiendo a través de Zoom, sí estamos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea. Lo único que tiene que hacer es apretar el icono, que es un globo, en la parte inferior de la pantalla. And also, lastly, the President Ali is going to be taking questions from the audience during the latter half of his presidential address. To be able to ask questions, all you have to do is line up on the microphone here in front of me to be able to ask your questions. Okay, so without further ado, I will present Dean Steinberg, who will provide the introductory remarks.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this 6th Annual Security Challenges in Latin America Forum. There's been a long tradition of SAIS and a very strong commitment to work in this region, but this forum is a very special collaboration between SAIS, the Perry Center, and the Woodrow Wilson Center that allows us to talk about in a very broad-ranging way a whole set of issues involving the region and to bring together scholars and practitioners who are focusing on these great challenges. It's a great partnership. We're really grateful not only to Jim Marquardt for his great leadership here at SAIS, but to our colleagues at the Perry Center and the Wilson Center for this wonderful collaboration. And it is very central to our own DNA here at SAIS. The Latin American program and the Latin American focus area has long been a hallmark of the work that we do here. As I think some of you know, that we now offer 13 graduate courses in different areas involving Latin America, including 3 capstone classes that offer opportunities for our students to travel throughout the region and to have all kinds of experiences that not only get you to have the kind of classroom experience that enriches your understanding, but also getting out and working with people in the region. So our goal is, through these fora, is to try to bring people together to share ideas and experiences and to try to think about innovative solutions to tackle some of these very thorny problems that the region faces. And the issues that you're discussing in this year's forum are among the most thorny and most consequential. And I am very, thrilled to see that we have this program which focuses on the sort of the fundamental issues that we're now facing in the region, particularly involving with environmental protection and land use in the Amazon basin and marine conservation. Because those of you who have been reading a little bit, and there's even an article, I think, in the New York Times today about how consequential these issues are. And so it's especially a great honor for us to have as our keynote speaker for this conference His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Ifram Ali, the President of Guyana. He is a true reflection of everything that we aspire to here at SAIS in terms of bringing expertise and knowledge and empirical understanding and rich analytic skills to the actual practical problems of the day, with a strong background in planning and a strong academic background in developing the analytic tools that have allowed him as president to try to bring innovative solutions to this set of challenges, which obviously affects not just his country and the region, but the world at large. And he's had a really remarkable career serving as project manager of the Caribbean Development Bank's project implementation in the unit of the Ministry of Finance, as senior planner, and had an experience both in the administrative side of dealing with these issues as well as a leader of his country. So it's really, I think, a great honor for us and a great opportunity to get his insights. I think it's important to share, although it's not directly related to our issues of the day, about the leadership that he's shown more broadly in the region. As some of you will know, Guyana now is on the Security Council and has the chairmanship of CARICOM. And there are many issues that he is having to deal with, including the leadership on the very deep challenges that the region is now facing in Haiti, and he's been able to share with us a little bit of his insight about the challenges there as well. So I know you're looking forward to both his remarks and the conversation with Paul, so at this point let me ask you to join me in welcoming President Ali to SAIS.
Good afternoon, everyone. To those of you in the audience and those of you from our alumni community, who are connected online. It is a real pleasure to be here once again at the podium, and I just wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to underscore the importance of our relationship, our institutional relationship at the Perry Center with Guyana. And it gives me immense pride to welcome our distinguished speaker, someone who represents the best of our community of practice and the promise of the enduring partnerships that we have fostered over decades at the Perry Center, His Excellency President Irfan Ali. A graduate of our 2008 Caribbean Security and Defense course, President Ali is a testament to our history of cooperation and the shared values, ambition, and determination to foster stability and prosperity in the Americas. Thanks to his vision and trust, we are building a robust relationship with the University of Guyana, and particularly its master's course in strategic development studies, and we are embracing the opportunity to support the establishment of Guyana's National Defense Institute. Welcome, Dr. Prasad, the newly named director of the Institute, for joining us today. This will be an important forum for policymakers, the private sector, civil society, academia, and security and defense leaders, not just from Guyana, but from across the Caribbean and the broader Americas region, to embrace the opportunities of today and to address the challenges of tomorrow. It's not lost on me that His Excellency comes from a family of educators, which no doubt influences the way he views delivering institutional transformation, national development, and social and cultural change. And so please join me once again for a round of applause for His Excellency President Ali.
Thank you very much for your very kind words. Distinguished members of the audience and those joining us online or any other technological means, I'm very pleased this afternoon to be here with you to share some perspective on a very important issue, land use and marine conservation in the Amazon basin and the Caribbean. We just, in February, shared some perspective at the United Nations on the consequential effect of war on climate and food security. So I think that this is a natural progression on a very important subject matter that the region faces, but more importantly, for us to have an understanding of how the region is positioned in conservation, climate change, ecological services, and biodiversity services. It is only when we understand how the region is positioned that we can have a holistic understanding as to how we deal with these challenges. Now, before I get into the presentation, I want to align my remarks with the Perry Center and the defense architecture of the region, because I believe strongly that this subject matter is intricately linked with national security. I think natural security and national security are greatly interlinked, and we must understand the interplay between natural security and national security. I believe that any event that disrupts national, regional, and international order has implications for security and defense. So any climatic event, any event that disrupts the normalcy of the day or the moment, or disrupt normal operations, has implications for national security and defense. So throughout this presentation, I want us to align the issues that I'm going to allude to national security and defense. It is only then that the world can understand that if we don't act in a unified way, if we don't act through shared values, then all of us will suffer, and none of us will be able to defend what is left. So, the land use and marine conservation are topics of global significance, especially for us in the Caribbean. As you know, we are developing countries. We have major financial difficulties. We are exposed to the harshest and greatest forms of climate events. Most of the economies in the region are completely dependent on tourism and other activities that are directly affected by climate event. The marine assets of the region is key to the economic life of the region. But more importantly, when you look at the Amazon basin, the forest asset is not only the key of existence in the region, but I will demonstrate to you that the Amazonian basin is the key for existence of humanity globally. So I'll now proceed to giving you an understanding as to where Guyana is, the country I represent. I have the honor and I'm humbled to lead, where we are in the Amazon basin and in the region. Guyana is positioned within the Amazon basin and the Caribbean region. We sit in several areas of ecological or biological significance. Guyana is part of the Amazon basin, where our southern ecosystem of the Rupununi, including the Essequibo watershed, is annually influenced by the Amazon during the rainy season. We are also part of the Guyana Shield, which is the oldest geological landform found in the region. So we are part of the Guyana Shield, we are part of the Amazon basin, and we are part of the Caribbean community. That is why our geographic position gives us some distinct responsibility and distinct advantages. If we look now at the Amazon basin and what it represents and the challenge it faces, you will see that the Amazon basin includes roughly 60% of the world rainforest. Now just let's pause here and understand why the Amazon basin is important. If we don't think that 60% of the world rainforest is important, then we don't believe that climate change is important. Then we don't believe that deforestation is important. Then we don't understand the realities of climate change and the role forests plays in stabilizing the ecological system, biological system, and contributing to mitigating against climate event. So this basin that we're talking about, the Amazon basin, includes 60% of the world's rainforests, 10% of the planet's known forms of life, including more than 40,000 plant species, 1,300 bird species, and several million species of insect and other invertebrates. What this means? This is not just numbers. This is linked to scientific research. This is linked to medical research. This is linked to biological life itself. The rainforest located in the Amazon basin is known as the lungs of the world. What is the value of the lungs of the world? Individually, we are dead without our lungs. Are we willing not to apply a value to the lungs of the world? Are we willing not to apply resources to protect the lungs of the world? Because whilst the forest, the Amazon basin is known as the lungs of the world, it is also a key and important asset for the livelihood of people and the livelihood of the economies. So we have to understand that some of the consequential effect of what is taking place there is to deal with the livelihood of people and livelihood of the economies. If the world values what the lungs of the world is, then what are we willing to do? What are we willing to invest in these lungs? Are we willing to have a fair value, a fair trade arrangement? Are we willing to monetize this value so that in protecting the lungs of the world, we do not deny the countries their economic well-being and the livelihood of the people? So it's a moral issue. That brings us to a very important issue, the moral issue. So what does this lungs of the earth do? It acts as a giant carbon sink that stores over 150 billion metric tons of carbon. What does this mean? Storing 150 billion metric tons of carbon. What this simply means is that this forest stores 10 years of global fossil fuel emission. It stores 10 years of global fossil fuel emission. You have an asset, a global asset, that stores 10 years of fossil fuel emission that has no value, that no one in the world is paying for. Is that fair? Is that sustainable? When we speak about sustainable development, and you read the literature on sustainable development, you will never see this, because it does not suit the order. But we have to disrupt the order if we want to protect what is going to keep us all alive. So in this equation, we have to understand what is the value of this basin that is storing 150 billion metric tons of carbon, and we have to attach a value to this basin if we're going to protect the basin. You would not protect something that you don't value. Or you can't say to protect it is valuable to the world and then you don't want to attach and ascribe the value. Because economies have to go on, people's life have to go on, society, infrastructure, all of these things must be invested in. In addition to this basin produces approximately 20% of the Earth's oxygen. Are we willing to give up 20% of the world's oxygen? Just imagine if we take 20% of the world's oxygen out of the equation, what happens with life? How are we valuing this 20% of the world's oxygen? And let us not be superficial in our argument and speak about moral value. Yes, we all must have moral suasion in policy making. But moral suasion cannot be minus of monetary, economic, and financial value. That cannot be what sustainable policy making is. So what does this do? It contributes to the lowering of land surface temperature and generating rainfall. We know the consequential effect of drought on food security. We are facing some of that now. So what has occurred in this basin over the past 50 years? Land use in the Amazon basin and the Caribbean. So over the past 50 years, we have seen some worrying trends and signs. Approximately 20% of the Amazon rainforest has been destroyed. This equates to over 300,000 square miles, or 77 hectares of forest loss, 7 million hectares of forest loss since 1970. Just imagine, 300,000 square miles of forest loss. From 2001 to 2012, forest losses in the Amazon basin approximates to about 17.7 million hectares, averaging 1.4 million hectares per year. That is the average forest loss annually. 1.4 million hectares annually. If we want to slow this, or we want to stop this, how are we going to create the incentive? How are we going to incentivize policy making and economic tool to mitigate this? We need action now. We need a structure now. And we need the world to understand the value of the forests and what role the forests play in keeping the planet alive. Many islands in the Caribbean have lost over 90% of their original forest cover as a result of hurricanes, result of agricultural purposes, urban development, tourism infrastructure. We also see critical coastal ecosystem like mangrove wetlands, seagrass beds, and dry forests being severely degraded or destroyed. And this is an image of the basin over the time period. It allows you to see exactly what is happening within the basin. If you look at the biodiversity aspect and value of this basin, and the biodiversity value of the basin allows us to understand that it is not only about protecting the forests and valuing the forest. It is also about what the forest contains, the biodiversity that it contains. In the last 50 years, the world has lost more than 60% of its biodiversity. More than 60% of its biodiversity. This has tremendous consequential effect on the future. Now, if you look at this slide, it gives you an understanding of the forest loss within the basin. And you would see that within this basin, we have a lot of indigenous communities. And that is another aspect of the effect of deforestation and forest loss that we have to take into consideration. How it affects the culture, life of the indigenous community. If you look at this image, it gives you a representation as to some of the activities that are going on in the basin that lead to deforestation and forest degradation. Important to note also is the quantum of fresh water that this basin holds. The largest storage of fresh water. If you look at the last 50 years, as I said, almost 20% of the Amazon rainforest has been destroyed. If you look at these images, it shows you parallel analysis as to what is happening. Now, scientists would have warned that we are dangerously close to the forest breaking point, which is 25% deforestation. Now, if you look at the scale of what we're talking about, you will see that the Amazon rainforest covers over 5 million square kilometers of land across 9 countries. If you go back to the slide before, one more before, right there, you will see that it covers 5 million square kilometers of land across 9 countries. Now, those in security and national defense would tell you the magnitude of security problem associated with such large area. Securing 5 million kilometers across 9 countries requires cross-border cooperation, requires integration of policies, requires coordinating defense structures, coordinating security structures, requires joint monitoring, requires shared values, requires common purpose, and this is what makes it challenging for national security and national defense. Because if national security and national defense must contribute to the protection of this ecosystem, then there must be an integrated approach among the countries that share this large landmass. There must be an investment in the assets that would help us to monitor, that would help us to defend and protect. So what is this inextricable link between national security and natural security? The situation is cause for concern. That is the deforestation, illegal mining, serious cause for concern, which in turn has great consequences for global security and climate change. Why? What are the consequences? If we allow 20% of the world's oxygen to go, or the lungs of the world to go, what will happen? You'll have forced migration. You'll have greater levels of poverty. Forced migration, greater levels of poverty, you'll have a destabilized region because poverty and migration leads to destabilization. Destabilization leads to migration. And that is the consequential effect in the region. People will look for other forms of revenue generation. And that is how the consequential effect on national security and national defense is linked to what is taking place. If we take a look now at the Caribbean, the tropical Caribbean regional ecosystem, as we know, is home to coral reefs, vibrant communities of fish and protected species that depend on reefs as habitats such as sea turtles. Recreation, tourism, shipping, and fisheries drive the economy of the Caribbean regional ecosystem. But what is some of the challenges? We don't have the infrastructure to protect the EEZ, the vast sea. We don't have the equipment. We don't have the personnel. We don't have the budgetary support to protect this asset. And the U.S. is intricately linked to this asset because this asset is used also for all forms of activity. That is why in the region, we believe that investing in the security of the U.S. must also investing in the security of the region. Investing in the monitoring of this vast ocean, investing in the infrastructure to support the security within the region. This must be part of the U.S. national security and defense plan. And if it is part of the U.S. national security and defense plan, then it must be seamlessly integrated in the region's security plan. With the type of assets we have, the type of assets we deploy, and ensuring that we can have a partnership that secure this great and important asset of the region. If you go back to the slide, you will see some images of the before and after. The challenge that the marine asset is facing. And we're not talking about a security challenge here with drugs, illegal fishing, because any illegal activity has limited or no respect for the asset itself. If it suits them, they will sink any asset into that water without thinking about the consequences. That is why national defense and national security is critically integrated in the defense of this asset. Responding to the climate crisis requires aligning, so what the scale of the problem again. What are we faced with? We are faced with a financial gap. When you ask how are we going to protect this asset, what are we doing? We have to understand that there is a major financial gap. We have to understand the magnitude of this gap. and the scale of the problem. So what is the scale of the problem? Responding to the climate crisis requires aligning an average of 19% of each country's GDP in Latin America and the Caribbean. So just to respond to the challenges we are faced with here, adaptation, mitigation, it requires aligning an average of 19% of each country's GDP in Latin America and the Caribbean. This is equivalent to 1.3 billion per year, US dollars per year in expenditure on infrastructure, defense, and social spending. So what happens? If you look at the chart, you will see that as countries invest in adaptation and mitigation, something else is suffering. So you'll see a reduction in defense spending, a reduction in security spending, and a reduction in social service spending. Because the scale of the problem is so intense. The cost of mitigation and adaptation alone in Latin America and the Caribbean is estimated to range between 90 to 100 billion per year, according to the IMF. This is the size of the problem in Latin America and the Caribbean. Just for adaptation and mitigation alone, the IMF is estimating investment of 90 to 100 billion per year. Where is this resource coming from? If we are not valuing the asset that we have to safeguard, where is the resource coming from? And that is why we have made the case, Guyana has made the case, that we need to have a market model that values the asset and that generates revenue for the asset, so that these resources that is critically needed for the safeguarding of the society can be raised. If you look at the costs exceed the financial flows to the region, thereby creating a financing gap that is estimated at 18 billion to respond and prevent losses, and 51 billion for adaptation between 2021 and 2030. That is the scale of the problem. If you look at this image here, it will show you Dominica and Grenada. Responding to one climate crisis requires aligning an average of 19% of annual GDP, representing from US 470 billion to 1.3 billion. The IMF reported, as I said, that the total cost, let's look at Dominica as an example after the hurricane. The IMF reported that the total cost of transforming Dominica into a disaster-resilient state over a 20-year period is estimated at US 2.8 billion, 5 times Dominica's GDP. Just imagine that. Imagine the scale of what is ahead of us. Where is this resource going to come from? With immediate impact of, and that is after the immediate impact of Hurricane Maria. That one event, Hurricane Maria, the damages from that one event in Dominica accounted for 226% of Dominica's GDP. Just understand, one event, in one night, the consequences. So let's turn our attention now to Guyana. In Guyana, we're developing a global model. Our forests, as you know, is the size of England and Scotland combined. We are one of the only countries with jurisdictional scale certification, the lowest deforestation rate in the world. Guyana is uniquely positioned within the Amazon basin and the Caribbean region on the path of using our oil wealth, and I want to raise this because we are developing a sustainable development model that allows us to use the wealth from our natural resource whilst not sacrificing our natural asset and deploying that natural asset to a global good. It is also part of the Caribbean region and is considered the largest state in the Caribbean community. Guyana's development is underpinned by the country's low-carbon development strategy that is now in its second phase of implementation. The LCDS outlines a vision on how economic development and environmental sustainability can both be achieved. The LCDS is not a climate document. The LCDS is an economic document also. It aligns climate and environmental issue with the economic realities of the country and define a path that is sustainable and cross-cutting in all the sectors. This is just an understanding of where we are as a country. 85% forest cover, one of the lowest rates of deforestation in the world for the past 12 years, consistently about 90% below the global average. 90% below the global average. One of 8 jurisdictions comprising the Amazon basin. One of the first countries to implement a low-carbon development strategy, forest carbon initiative, and payment for ecosystem services mechanism. The only English-speaking country in South America. Biologically rich and diverse. Home to the longest single-drop waterfall in the world. Home to the first settlers of the country, the indigenous population of Amerindians. And this is a model of what the LCDS is all about. So the asset is high forest cover, major carbon sink. Guyana is open to investing its 19.5 gigatons of carbon that the forest stores to the global ambition of reducing or achieving the 1.5 degrees target. So what is our objective? First of all, we recognize that this 19.5 gigatons and this forest cover is a global asset. A global asset must carry a value. And we recognize that this asset must be deployed in the market because it is part of an economic model that speaks to the livelihood of people, that speaks to the economic well-being of the country. So in doing so, we have the strategic positioning of this asset. And that is, Guyana is part of the Guyana Shield, a distinct ecoregion of the larger Amazon basin. Guyana is home to approximately 4% of known animal species and 2.4% of known plant species, including many iconic Amazonian species. That also carries a value. Not only the value of the standing forests, we are now moving and taking our attention to the ecological value, the biological value, because this value must be monetized in the future. That is why it's a value. It carries a monetized value. Otherwise, why do we describe it as an asset? Why do we describe it as an asset? So this is a model of the system that we are part of. If you look at this slide, it shows you Guyana has maintained high forest cover and rich biodiversity. This is just an image and a graph to show you how we have consistently kept our forest cover and avoided deforestation. Not because we don't have the opportunity to have economic use of the land and deforestation for agricultural purposes, mining purposes, but because we took a conscious decision that this is an asset we're going to protect for the world, but it's an asset we know must be valued and paid for. Very simple model. Very simple model. These are some images of some of the assets the forest holds. Now, as I said before, our rainforests, 85% of the land mass. The forest sequesters more carbon than it generates. Very important, because this point is going to become relevant very soon. Therefore, making Guyana a net carbon sink. Our country's forests sequesters approximately 154 million tons of carbon annually. Even as an oil-producing country, we will remain a net carbon sink, since it is estimated that at peak production, emissions from the FPSO were merely a fraction of the carbon sequestered by the forest. For instance, every FPSO will only emit 2 million tons of carbon at peak production. Therefore, 10 FPSO at peak production will only generate 20 million tons of carbon per year. In this regard, you would see that our natural asset not only mitigate or help us to be sustainable in the petroleum sector, but it also gives us leverage to deploy this carbon sink to the global fight on climate change. Now, as we move to the next slide, I would ask one question. And we have to be truthful about these issues. How is the world going to deal with the tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions, who still live in energy poverty? What is the world plan to move away from coal, which still accounts for close to 30% of all energy produced? Let's look at logical things. The most pollutant, coal. How are we going to move away from coal? How are we dealing with batteries? Are we all comfortable with one economy having the dominant role in the production of batteries and lithium? These are key questions from a security perspective too. Are we setting global standards and global targets while we are issuing more license? Is it national security that drives our decision making? If national security drives our decision making, then our international posture and position should be one that understands the reality and speak to the reality of the problem that we are faced with. Energy costs and energy insecurity. It is not that Guyana is without threat. We are below sea level. Our coast is below sea level. In this image, you will see what is a control structure. Decades upon decades ago, built by the Dutch, where the sea defense structure was and where it is today. We have to maintain those structures. Where is the revenue going to come from? Who is going to finance it? What systems are in place globally to support countries like ours in financing this? This is the tip of Guyana's coastline. As you can see, this pristine protected area called Shell Beach. But as you can also see, the erosion that is taking place in this area. This is a image of other areas along this stretch of beach. You can see flooding and saltwater intrusion causing loss of habitats for biodiversity. And along the coast, you will see the impact of saltwater intrusion on food production. Tens of thousands of acres of land destroyed for 5 to 6 years before they can come back into production because of saltwater intrusion. This is another example of coastal erosion and saltwater intrusion. So we have to build infrastructure to protect communities and people from these challenges. In Guyana, more than 90% of the population live on the coastal plain, which is about 0.5 and 1 meter below sea level. To maintain a robust sea defense that is 280 miles long, it will cost $13 billion per annum, 65 million US dollars per annum. That is just to maintain. To maintain adequate drainage system, because we're below sea level, we have to have a drainage system, an irrigation system, and a defense system. It will also cost more than twice that amount. For almost every country, this results in a reduction in investment in sectors such as national defense, education, and healthcare. These are hard decisions that countries have to face that have foreseen and unforeseen detrimental consequences. This is the reality. What are the success stories and practical measures? You will see that our system has many success stories, and we have implemented a number of measures. The sustainable use, management, and conservation of terrestrial land and ocean resources. We build institutions to support sustainable development at all levels, including its human resource capacity. We are building a world-class education system, a world-class healthcare system, building infrastructure that will integrate the Guyana Shield and South America, repositioning Guyana because of its geographic advantage to be the transport and logistics hub of the region, positioning Guyana to be a global leader on climate change, food security, and energy security. Those are the elements of the work that we are doing. We are actively pursuing new and innovative climate finance mechanism. And this is important. When you look at the value of the asset we are examining today, we must understand that we have to pursue a new and innovative climate finance mechanism, with forests playing a key and important role. And we are working towards providing global leadership on the development of this mechanism, the advancement of the mechanism, but more importantly, getting this new mechanism, financial mechanism, as part of the global system, part of the market. That is important for us. If we move on, you will see that we have successfully been able to have 2 market-based carbon sale, one with Hess Corporation, the first ever with a petroleum producer. And what did we do? We used these to transform livelihoods in the village community. We have 242 indigenous villages across the country, mostly in these forested areas. By law, we have made it clear that all the revenue earned from carbon credit sale, 15% of the revenue is transferred directly to the indigenous community. There is no other country that has this. 15% is transferred directly to these communities so they can implement projects and they can develop their own livelihood structures and projects. to support their villages and the village economy. In the forest sale, we had 4.7 billion Guyana dollars transferred to these communities. And to date, more than 800 projects are in different stages of implementation. Many of those projects are in the areas of ecotourism and sustainable farming. We're collaborating with our development partners on climate and environment. We're engaging our continental and regional partners to address transboundary movements, and this is important. Because if we don't collaborate and coordinate on transboundary movement and to align our environmental laws, align our policy on forests and protecting the forests, then we will continue to have development in one area and deforestation in one area. That does not help us to deploy in large scale this basin as a global tool, but also as a global asset and earning from the market. This is an image of mangrove, and if you come to Guyana, you will see that this is along our coastline, long stretches of mangrove. And if you go to the next image, you will see an example of an area in 2021 and what it looks like in 2022. You will see in 2021, there was no mangrove. Look at 2022, the rate of growth. These are the real examples of how we are providing leadership and what we are doing to ensure that we contribute positively to the healthy life of the planet. It's important that we examine security, laws that promote enforcement, human security, and protection of this asset. So we have the environmental regulations enforcement. We have laws on combating wildlife crime, maritime enforcement, environmental crimes investigation. We have specific regulations dealing with this. And of course, now we're investing heavily in technology and innovation to ensure that we have a monitoring and verification system that helps us in decision making and help us to understand what is happening with this great asset. We believe that we have a replicable model for scalable solution to environment protection in the LCDS, especially for a forested country, that would allow countries to maintain their forests, that would allow national and global climate action, that would help countries with forests to move to the market. Once we work together, we can move to the market. That would have continuous flow of forest carbon financing, because this is important, and that will bring value to countries with forests, bring value to this asset, and will help, this model will help to monetize this asset in securing development, advancing prosperity, and building sustainable development. So, in closing, we live in a challenging time in our world today, yet with each challenge, the human spirit offers tremendous room for innovation and opportunity. A fair, inclusive, sustainable, and prosperous world is possible for the Amazon, the Caribbean, and the global ecosystem. It is within our reach. It is within our reach. We need to collectively find that willpower to change the attitude of the world on forests and to move this asset to the market, to monetization, so that we can work now on securing it and investing in the regrowth of this asset. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President, for that tour de force, which gets to the heart of the themes that we've addressed in the conference today. I would like to invite anybody who has a question for His Excellency to join us at one of the two microphones, but I will take the moderator's privilege and ask the first question. When I was listening to you speak, I felt like I was listening to a leader of the future in the way that you talk about the environment and conservation and protection and energy and food security. But I think that leads us to the conclusion that actually the future is now, the future is here. And people from our generation are acutely aware and have been acutely aware of the risks of environmental degradation for our entire lifetimes. Something else that our generation is acutely aware of is the value of viral moments on social media. And last week, in Hard Talk with the BBC, you had a viral moment that I've seen circulating on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and Twitter. And I just wanted to...
I don't think I had a viral moment. I think the truth had a viral moment.
Yeah, there we are. And the reception, as I understand it, has been very positive globally. But how has that message been received back in your homeland of Guyana?
Well, I believe that the message is one that all Guyanese believe in. But I think what has caught the attention of so many people is that this is a message that many wanted to deliver, but few delivered it. And that is what caught the attention of the world. It is a message waiting to be delivered, waiting to be heard, and we are very humbled that we were able to deliver that message, and so many people heard it. And the positive reaction tells a story that the old structure cannot hold the global population. If we do not understand that there are flaws in the old structure that must be corrected, then we're living in a false reality that the old structure is successful and will give us the result we want to achieve. As leaders, we have to examine the old structure. We have to dive deep into what are the problems the developing world is facing in relation to this structure. And the developed world has a responsibility also to adopt new posture, to adopt new methods in addressing those concerns, in mitigating against those concerns, while the developing world also has a responsibility in building systems and institutions that would support the growth and development of their country in a fair, open, democratic, transparent way that is based on the rule of law. And once we do that, then we remove the ability of anyone to believe that they are speaking from a superior structure. But unless we all examine the root cause of where we are today, simple example is on the forest. We can preach every day, keep the forest, safeguard the forest, stop deforestation. But what are we willing to pay for this? What are we willing to invest for this? How are we willing to make the necessary adjustments in our budget in the developed world to support and upkeep the lungs of the world? Are we even willing to make those adjustments? We, as a newcomer in oil and gas, we said, as a country, carbon tax, let's discuss it. We support it. And we said, let us start by removing all subsidies. All subsidies given for petroleum production, wherever subsidies are given. So you create a disincentive in the system. But at the same time, let us value the assets that are critical for the survival of the planet. Let us value those assets and ensure that evaluation is not only in talk, but in payment.
Thank you, Mr. President. We will take two questions at a time. Cindy and then Gerardo.
Great.
Please introduce yourself with your name and affiliation.
Sure. I'm Cindy Ornson. I'm an adjunct professor here at SAIS and also a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. Thank you, Mr. President, for those passionate remarks and for your leadership in forest protection, not only in your own country, but around the world. You've made a passionate case for the way that the value of the asset of the forest needs to be monetized. And I was wondering if you could let us know if you see any of the international financial or international development institutions being open to that argument in terms of actually paying the significant amount of money that you have rightly pointed out, is needed to invest in this area, whether there's any receptivity. And as a side question, are there existing market mechanisms that have been successful in helping countries to pay for the preservation of economic assets? Thank you.
And then, Gerardo, if you could just ask your question as well.
Yes. Hi, Gerardo Pinchina Cárdenas. I'm with Albert Stonebridge Group. I actually wrote my master's thesis on Guyana's energy security, so it's really a great honor to be able to ask these questions to you. Staying in topic regarding this conference, what is the progress of artisanal illegal gold mining in Guyana in general? What are the efforts, or is there any specific policy of the current government regarding those things? Also thinking about climate resilience and also really trying to push for carbon markets to materialize. Also, additionally, I would like to ask you about the Amaila Falls hydropower project. Is there anything on that, or is that project just not going to happen? And yes, thank you for your time and for being here.
Thank you. Mr. President?
Thank you. Thank you very much for those questions. First of all, in relation to the international community support and the different international funds, in terms of the payment mechanism and valuing, I would say there is tremendous commitment in words in understanding that there is a value. But there is very limited movement towards developing a mechanism through which that value is monetized. Even in the adjustment of the debt figures or write-off as a result of countries' contribution to the climate equation, those things are not getting the type of reaction that it deserves. So what is critical and what is needed, and we have to be frank about this, is for the countries that influences global decision-making and policy-making to acknowledge this value and to write this value in their own policy-making frame and to lead by example. And to lead by example by supporting a market-based mechanism. If you look at the IMF, they have already come up with a value on the carbon market. We're not achieving even 10% of that value, 20% of that value. So it is a lack of will. Whilst on one hand, the world is saying, we must take these measures, we must adopt these policies. On the other hand, there is no commitment when it comes to providing the resources. There is no commitment when it comes to valuing and monetizing the assets that are key in keeping our planet alive. So what is it you're telling those countries? We can't support you to keep this asset alive. We know that this asset is contributing to our well-being and welfare in the world. But sorry, we can't pay you for it. We want you to keep it standing, but we can't pay you for the service it is providing for us. And let us understand, the forest standing is providing a service to every citizen in the world. And in any society, in any economic structure or model, you have to pay for that service. You have to pay for that service. And that is why we believe that the time has come for this monetization to be structured and to be compulsory. And that is what we are pushing ahead with. And why Guyana model is an example is because we have successfully proven that there is a market, although it's a voluntary market we went after. I said Hess Corporation. We had a sale of carbon, and our carbon is all certified, R3 certified. So we have legacy carbon, and we have current carbon for the market. So we were one of the first countries to have an agreement with the Kingdom of Norway, and then we had an end-user agreement with Hess Corporation. We now are working on having another agreement. So we have proven that the model can work, although it's a voluntary market, but we now have to move that on a global scale in a very structured market. And that is what we want to do. Work with everyone in bringing this. Illegal gold mining in the Amazon basin in the region, we have had to deal with this. As you know, if you look at our population and the size of our defense force and our law enforcement capability, you will see how difficult it is to police our geographic space or to monitor it. Thankfully, today, we can deploy technology that is helping us, and we're investing in that technology, so we have greater success in identifying illegal mining and in bringing those who are culpable to justice. So we have had tremendous reduction in illegal mining. We have more constant monitoring. We have invested more in field officers, and we have more technology, as I said, deployed to help us in mitigating against this. The Amalas Falls project, yes, that project is still on. We have recently concluded expression of interest for the building out of this project that will move us closer to sustainable and clean energy production. This is a 165 megawatts power plant that, added with natural gas, will remove us from fossil fuel, bunker fuel, that will bring us towards a more cleaner production of energy, that with solar and wind that we are pursuing.
All right, we have time for one more question, which I think I'm going to ask, but thank you to the rest of you who were interested in asking the President a question. And this strays a little bit from our theme today, but it's something that I wanted to follow up with you on after our conversation last year at the National Defense University, and that's the status of the border dispute over the Essequibo with Venezuela. In recent months, you and Nicolas Maduro have exchanged gifts as a goodwill gesture, and then in recent days, unfortunately, Venezuela has insisted on its sovereignty over the Essequibo and has in fact encoded its assertion of that claim into law. Can you tell us where the dispute stands legally, diplomatically, and the effect that it is having on relations in South America and the greater Caribbean region?
Well, for us, it's not a dispute. This is a controversy. We know exactly where our borders are. And I'm happy you saw we exchanged some gifts of peace and love. Yeah, you exchanged some sanctions. So we exchange different things. I would say that, look, we are pursuing a peaceful outcome. Guyana's objective is to ensure that this region remains stable, a region of peace, and our forest form of defense, as you know, we have had tremendous collaboration with the U.S. and cooperation. We have and I want to take a moment to applaud the type of relationship and partnership that we are building, not only in relation to our border, but in every aspect of development on climate, our joint operation in the fight against drug trafficking, our collaboration on food security, our collaboration on different global issues. So we have been working together on many different fronts and areas. So our forest form of defense is diplomacy. We want peaceful coexistence with our neighbors. We want to ensure that no action is initiated from Guyana that can destabilize the region, that can contribute to the creation of one more problem in the world. We want to help to removing problems from the world. So, but at the same time, we are not naive. We are very careful, very watchful about everything that is happening. We believe in international law. We have called upon our neighbors to participate fully in the ICJ process and to respect the outcome of the ICJ process. But we are a country that is acutely aware of where our borders are, and we are a country that is determined to ensure that all that is contained within our borders remain within our borders and remain the assets of Guyana. We have no intention of coveting any other assets from any one of our neighbors. Our only intention is to live peacefully and to develop our country for the Guyanese people, but more importantly, ensuring that our prosperity leads to regional prosperity. The position of the region is that we have to work in an integrated way to optimize the benefit that the region offers to its people. President Lula has been providing very strong relationship in building back that regional integration, in working on a massive project that aligns the transport integration, the economic integration, the energy integration of South America and going all up the Guyana Shield. And I think that the vision, recently we had a trilateral between Guyana, Suriname, and Brazil with President Santoki and President Lula. And we have outlined very clearly what we see this integration, how we see the integration should look like and would look like. And Venezuela must understand that they're part of a region that is working on establishing strong credentials in relation to the rule of law, democracy, respect for each other, respect for territorial integrity. And we're going to do all that we can to encourage our neighbors to be good global citizens and not to deviate from the path of what is good for the citizens of the region and the citizens of Guyana and Venezuela. Thank you.
On that note, Mr. President, thank you for your global citizenship, your leadership, your partnership, and your friendship. And thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for having me. You're a very patient audience. If you are in the Caribbean, by now you have had a lot of hungry hands in the air. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody, and we'll get started. For those that are participating over Zoom, we are offering simultaneous translation. All you have to do is press the little icon, the globe icon, on the bottom of the screen. Para los que están participando a través de Zoom, sí estamos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea. Lo único que tienen que hacer es apretar el el icono del globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla y seleccionar español para recibir las traducciones. Also, one last note, we are doing questions in the second half or towards the end of the panel, and so we have some microphones set up right here in the front, and then halfway up the auditorium, there's another set of microphones up there. So just line up if you want to ask any questions. With that being said, I would like to present Benjamin Ganan, two-time graduate from SAIS with a graduate degree and a PhD, and also a fellow contributor in this forum with the Wilson Center. He's the director of the Latin American program at the Wilson Center.
Excellent. Welcome to everyone here, everyone following online, those of you who've been with us throughout the day for this exceptional conference on an exceptionally urgent theme, and in particular, the remarks we just had from the president of Guyana on the importance of conservation, both marine and on land in the Americas. I'll talk very briefly about why we feel at the Wilson Center this is such an urgent concern, and then we'll turn to our panel, the third of the day, titled "The Role of Armed Forces and Law Enforcement in Protecting the Environment." The forests of Latin America and the Caribbean, as we've heard throughout the day, are essential to the fight against global warming. The region is, of course, also home to several of the most biodiverse countries on the planet. It is home to the second largest reef in the world, and of course the Amazon, the largest rainforest on Earth. Yet the climate and biodiversity crises have had devastating effects in the region, the result of factors including unsustainable farming and ranching, habitat loss, and pollution. Fortunately, there is growing recognition of the importance of environmental conservation and impressive demonstrations of political will throughout the Americas, including in the United States and in its approach to policy throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. In one of the most compelling recent examples, Ecuador, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Panama established the Eastern Tropical Pacific Marine Corridor, a historic transnational marine protected area that includes the Galapagos Islands. Several countries, including Chile, have met or exceeded the target of protecting 30% of their marine territory. Brazil has significantly slowed deforestation in the Amazon and is promoting closer coordination and partnership amongst the Amazon basin countries. 24 countries in the Americas have signed the Escazú Agreement to guarantee access to environmental information and greater public participation in environmental decision-making. Importantly and worryingly, translating these commitments to long-term meaningful environmental protection has not been easy and will not be easy if we continue with our current policies in terms of the international community's accompaniment of Latin American governments in environmental protection. Many countries in the region, perhaps most, lack the basic law enforcement and military resources, training, and tools to enforce environmental laws, including the ambitious marine protected areas and Amazon conservation initiatives that have been announced over the last few years. This is especially true, perhaps, given the region's worsening struggles with metastasizing organized crime, reshuffling the priorities of law enforcement and the armed forces in the Americas. Attempts at so-called green finance, such as the blue bond that is helping to pay for marine conservation in Ecuador, are helping and will help increasingly in the coming years. But it is not nearly enough to prepare and equip the region's police, sailors, and soldiers to protect protected areas, to detect and combat deforestation and illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, illegal mining, and other threats to Latin America's natural spaces, and to investigate and disrupt local, regional, and international criminal networks that are exploiting the region's natural riches. For that important mission, Latin America and the Caribbean need greater international support. Encouragingly, the United States and other partners of Latin America and the Caribbean share the region's environmental objectives and have a long tradition of providing security cooperation to strengthen local capacity to build the rule of law and to disrupt transnational crime, traditionally narcotics trafficking and arms trafficking, and fighting terrorism. It is time to dedicate more of that assistance and attention, both material and in training, to environmental protection. For this reason, in partnership with our colleagues at Johns Hopkins University, at SAIS, we are launching today our Latin America Environment Security Initiative, with the goal of engaging security and environmental conservation experts, policymakers, and lawmakers to develop new strategies and policy recommendations for supporting the region's police and armed forces in their efforts to complement civilian authorities responsible for environmental protection, both at sea and in the Amazon. This initiative builds upon the Wilson Center's extensive research and activities on related issues, including our partnership with the State Department to help protect marine protected areas in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. Already, today's terrific conference has contributed enormously to this initiative, which is why we chose this venue to launch it today. It has clarified the scale of the challenges and the need for greater international support so that Latin American and Caribbean governments might realize their own ambitious conservation objectives. This exceptional panel will be no exception. I'll have the special guests and experts introduced by my colleague, Max Nathanson from the Perry Center now. But before I conclude, I want to just take a moment to thank our extraordinary partners on the initiative going forward, but most of all on this remarkable conference today. They include our hosts, the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, my alma mater, as Jim has pointed out, and Jim Warkart, the faculty co-lead for the Americas Focus Area. Also the Perry Center and its director, Paul Angelo, and my colleagues at the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute, Environmental Change and Security Program, and Polar Institute, who participated in the planning of these events and moderated 2 of the great panels. Thank you all for the collaboration and partnership, and please enjoy our discussion on the role of the security services in environmental conservation in the Americas. Max, over to you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. It's great to see all the exciting news in this space, and we look forward to watching that collaboration flourish in the future. Again, my name is Max Nathanson. I'm honored to serve as the Fellow for Climate Security Studies at the Perry Center. This panel will further discuss opportunity for leveraging the resources and expertise of security, defense, and other protective forces in service of environmental protection. This is, on one hand, a long-standing phenomenon, as management of natural resources, land use, nature loss, and environmental degradation have always been both causes and outcomes of security challenges. The rate and scale of climate change, however, have prompted a renewed focus on what the climate mission is, so to speak. These questions are critical for a multidimensional, multi-layered understanding of security and sustainable development more broadly across the Americas. I think President Ali perfectly teed up this panel by laying out the global significance and gravity of these discussions, really illustrating the what and the why. And for this panel, I'm really excited to delve more into the how, of how does that protection actually take place. So we're very honored to have a truly expert panel on hand. And I will introduce each panelist before they provide their initial interventions, and then we will move to a more fluid panel discussion with some Q&A. First, it is my great honor to welcome Dr. Hila Levy. Dr. Levy serves concurrently as the Assistant Director for Ocean, Polar, and Natural Security in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as the Director for Science, Technology, and Workforce Strategy on the National Security Council. Dr. Levy has served as an Air Force Intelligence and Foreign Area Officer, including on the Joint Staff, and has been a polar and marine ecologist, virologist, and geneticist, translator in 6 languages, and a climate security advocate in parallel military and civilian careers. In her roles at the White House, she has contributed to national strategy and foreign policy development, including the 2022 U.S. National Security Strategy, has represented the U.S. at bilateral and multinational security dialogues. Among other degrees, Dr. Levy holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University, doctorate from the University of Oxford, where she was the first Rhodes Scholar from Puerto Rico. Dr. Levy, you've had an incredibly wide-ranging career touching on a number of issues this forum has highlighted. Walk us through the lens of natural security for you, how this has informed your approach to broader foreign policy development. Where do you see the priorities for security cooperation and law enforcement? Where have been some of the best advancements, and where is there still room for growth?
Thanks so much. Hope this works. Okay. Thank you for having me, and thank you so much to the hosts, to SAIS, to the Wilson Center, and to the Perry Center for having all of us. And it's an honor to share the stage with this distinguished set of panelists and your overall lineup today. What a great day. And thank you for allowing me to speak here today on behalf of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Not many people know about us, but our work is to maximize the benefits of science and technology to advance health, prosperity, security, environmental quality, and justice for all Americans. And I'm also grateful to be able to represent the National Security Council, which has played a really critical role in our environment-related foreign policy in this administration. The administration has taken tremendous, bold action and investment to tackle the climate crisis at home and abroad. But as you asked me, Max, I want to focus on a topic near and dear to my heart and work at the White House, which is the concept of natural security, not national, natural security, which as a framework recognizes that the protection and sustainable management of natural resources and biodiversity and ecosystems are integral to national security, to social stability, health, and economic prosperity. Natural security understands how climate change is unfortunately increasing the harmful interactions and exploitation of biodiversity through trafficking, overfishing, loss of forest cover and pollinators, and the increased risk of zoonotic disease spillover, and how human actions in challenging socioeconomic contexts further drive these harmful interactions. Our efforts as a federal government have prioritized the protection of biodiversity, our lands, our coasts, our rivers, wetlands, the ocean, and both of our polar regions. And President Biden set a goal to achieve the conservation of at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. In English, we say that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Más vale prevenir que curar. And conservation and nature-based solutions are worthwhile pursuits in preventing irreversible losses of the planet's rich biodiversity while working to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming within reach. And this, of course, can't be done alone. And there are many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean who have managed to lead very boldly, conserving 30% of their ocean, like Colombia and Chile, protecting huge swaths of terrestrial ecosystems like we just heard in Guyana and in Costa Rica, and coming together to improve our science and our understanding of natural systems like we do with Brazil, Canada, and several other countries in the All-Atlantic Ocean Research and Innovation Alliance, and now in the Partnership for Atlantic Cooperation, where we have over 38 countries, with a new working group focused on marine spatial planning that we've just had our first meeting of. So when I think about our work as a federal government, working across the Western Hemisphere, I see our partners, including those that are in security elements, like the armed forces and law enforcement, as guardians of some of the most precious ecosystems and wildlife on Earth, the Amazon, the coral reefs, the Andes, the Antilles, and more. But we find ourselves facing a grave challenge that jeopardizes that delicate balance of our ecosystems and threatens our food security and sustainability, and that's environmental crime. Wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, and illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. These issues are not limited to Latin America and the Caribbean, but they require a certain shift in how we view national security, given a broader climate, biodiversity, security nexus. Poaching, logging, and trafficking of endangered species not only rob us of our natural heritage, but they also contribute to global insecurity, economic instability, and the degradation of our environment. These matters can seem incredibly localized. So the trade of a singular part or organ from a very unique endangered species found in just one body of water or habitat or biome, but there's a whole ecosystem of interactions driving that trade and driving the actions of the tier 1 actors who are doing the poaching or the fishing, who then pass that on to the next tier trafficker up the value chain, and then further into the black markets that cross borders and oceans. When as a federal government we look at those issues and nature crimes, we don't just think about them in terms of the absolute tragedy and travesty of the irreversible destruction that's taken place. And yes, those images when we see the seizures on the border are very hard to ignore. But addressing these is, of course, the right thing to do for the planet, but it's very much about the security, stability, and ensuring the rule of law and the well-being of the international order and the international system as we know it and as we've shaped it as a democracy. And so that's why in the National Security Strategy, which is our gospel, our Bible for how we go about approaching national security and foreign policy, for the first time ever in that document in 2022, we state the world's interconnected ocean, lands, waterways, and other ecosystems generate economic opportunity and enable critical commercial and military activity. They contain biodiversity, vital to food security, clean air and water, a stable climate, and health and well-being. And we, for the first time, directly indicate that threats to these systems, including pollution and unregulated deforestation and wildlife trafficking and IUU fishing, impact governments' abilities to meet basic human needs and contribute to political, economic, and social instability. Right now, transnational criminal organizations are operating nimbly, corruptly, and violently, and take advantage of socioeconomic challenges to enrich themselves, while undermining and co-opting legitimate governance functions globally. The wide swath of goods that we see trafficked range from weapons to drugs to people to wildlife, timber, and other illicit or counterfeit products, and they leave behind death, debt, bondage, weakened governance, and insecurity for communities and the environment. In the Western Hemisphere, with the unfortunate exception of Haiti, all of our nations are party to the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. It's just called CITES. And as a component, the Western Hemisphere is just one small part of the 184 parties to the convention. The United States takes this responsibility incredibly seriously. We work on numerous lines of effort, bilaterally, trilaterally, and multilaterally, to counter illicit trade. It's not just a biodiversity issue, it's a foreign policy issue. It's absolutely critical to our national security when we see drug cartels turning fish and wildlife products into their revenue sources. And it's more than just the flora and fauna that lose. It's the people being exploited along the value chain, from countries of origin through to transit countries like the United States and on to destination countries for black markets that are trying to circumvent the regulations for import and export under this Convention for Endangered and Listed Species. And you layer onto that the issues that you probably heard about earlier today on the IUU panel about IUU fishing and associated labor abuses. So from the vantage point of the White House, we've worked incredibly hard to make clear that we're done siloing these into individual issues. We have to mainstream nature into all decision-making and into the security sphere. We have a presidential task force on wildlife trafficking, which is in its 11th year of activity, established by executive order under President Obama, and it's supported by bipartisan legislation like the End, Neutralize, and Disrupt, it's END is the acronym, End Wildlife Trafficking Act, and 2 presidential level actions to address particular findings of concern in just the past year under the CITES Convention. We also have a 21 agency interagency working group on countering IUU fishing, which was further bolstered by President Biden's National Security Memorandum 11 on combating IUU fishing and associated labor abuses in conjunction with the Maritime Security and Fisheries Enforcement, or MSAFE Act. We continue to work with partners in the Western Hemisphere on capacity building, detection, and enforcement, alongside other international organizations and the regional fisheries management organizations. So when we think about the role of militaries and law enforcement, I come from a military background and I understand there's some skepticism of mission creep or thinking that the environment is a problem for domestic agencies. But these threats and activities are so complex and they really do require the whole of government. You need intelligence sharing. You need all domain awareness and patrols or observations, and those are often by militaries or by security forces. You need technological tool development to be able to do more with less. You need robust democratic legal authorities that allow for interagency data sharing and cooperation. And you need law enforcement bodies who are trusted and well paid and empowered, and a strong judicial system to really close the loop on the prosecutions, because without that, you don't have the full suite of the tools you need for the rule of law and for deterrence of these crimes. There's a lot more I can say about these issues, and there's a lot of work to do, but one thing I can say is that I am optimistic about the fact that we're having this conversation, and that the highest levels of American national security and foreign policy setting are thinking holistically about these intersections with the natural security lens, and that we're finding ways to bolster our security cooperation internationally with allies and partners to find solutions. When we pool our knowledge, our resources, and expertise, we can enhance our ability to detect, investigate, and prosecute those involved in environmental crime networks and dismantle the illegal operations at their roots. But everyone, including militaries and law enforcement, have a role to play, as the overall risks of climate change often drive the resource scarcity or economic incentives to degrade and destroy natural resources. We have to do this by recognizing the interconnectedness of environmental crimes to other pressing challenges, such as climate change, corruption, organized crime, and poverty. And so I'll just close by saying that I truly hope that together we can strengthen our collaboration and information sharing and build each other up for the collective security of this hemisphere and our planet. So thanks so much, Max.
Thank you, Dr. Lowy. I really appreciate that dynamic perspective, as well as highlighting the immense amount of work that this administration has put into these areas. Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Mirlis Reyes, who serves as a professor at the Inter-American Defense College. He's an expert in the political economy of defense and security, illicit economies, and community development, Latin America and the Caribbean. The IADC, Dr. Reyes also serves as faculty liaison for the Intercultural Communications Workshop, coordinator of the Crisis Simulation Exercise, and is the editor-in-chief of the journal Hemisferio. She's also an expert member of the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Dr. Reyes is originally from Havana, Cuba, and earned her doctorate at the University of Macerata in Italy. Dr. Reyes, you've published extensively on illicit economies, local community development in the region, in addition to leading regional defense education efforts. What strategies have you seen be the most effective or should be viewed moving forward in enhancing the involvement of armed and security forces in environmental protection?
Yes. First, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to share ideas on this relevant topic. Yes, it's widely recognized that environmental degradation multiplies vulnerabilities and threat to national defense and security. Environmental crime is the third most prevalent activity of transnational organized crime globally. And we have already analyzed here how illegal mining has increased, serving as money laundering for other illegal activity like drug trafficking. So it fuels violence, criminal culture, corruption, and enlarge social and environmental vulnerabilities. So in response, armed and security forces play a dual role in environmental protection, combating illicit activities and addressing their effect through humanitarian assistance and prevention efforts. What is the best strategy to support this role? Because both roles requires multidimensional approach and interagency cooperation. So for this, to respond that question, I want to focus on 4 strategic guidelines. First, it's necessary to adopt a comprehensive approach that considers 5 dimensions: economic, political, legal, cultural, and social. Within a political economy framework, we have to recognize a fundamental principle by which organized crime runs its business. As long as there is demand, there will be supply, if the activity is lucrative, of course. So that means that it's not enough to combat illicit activity on the supply side. That is, by eliminating cartels or criminal organization. We must also work on the demand side. That means on those who consume the illicit products. So awareness-raising campaigns should be carried out, recognizing the global nature of the demand and the needs of a cooperation and consensus building to determine what is the most effective strategy for each reduction. Every political decision has an impact on illicit markets. When policies are focused on specific areas, they may lead to a balloon effect, causing a rise in criminal activities in surrounding territories or countries. When they lack consistency over time, they can contribute to future setbacks in criminal activity also. So in a sense, criminals invest in ventures that offer maximum profits, minimum risk, and competitive advantages. That is why it's so important to identify legal gaps in national and interstate legislations. What kind of penalty are established for each crime? Environmental crime usually receive lighter penalty compared to other kind of illicit activity. What is the probability of being convicted? The law in many cases in our region is still not the same for everyone. So this results in a culture of transgression, which is also reproduced by popular TV series, movies, music, influencing young people. So from the social dimension, in addition to inequality, the lack of educational and labor opportunities and poverty, there is a kind of fragmented colonization by organized crime in the hemisphere. And in some communities, the organized crime enslave victims of human trafficking and exploit indigenous people in the area, in trying to or imposing their business model and the criminal culture. So these communities are gradually adapting to survive in symbiotic relationship with the criminal organization that controls them. This explains why some officers in the region have encountered people who, while recognize their efforts, request them to depart from the territory and allow them to continue with the illegal activity. That is the only and the best mean to they have to provide for their family. So for the armed and security forces to effectively contribute to environment protection, they must work collaboratively with the communities, trying to break with their enclosure or isolation. The second strategic guideline is to encourage state policies in collaboration with local community and other government agencies. Interdiction actions must be more consistent. They are subject to government policies, budgets, and current needs. For example, in Peru, satellite measuring highlighting the damage caused by illegal mining in Madre de Dios stimulated a governmental response against this activity. But in the last 5 years, budget allocation for combating illegal mining have only decreased 26% for production, indicating the low priority this issue currently has in the country. In Ecuador, Argentina, Peru, Chile, the media covers the impact of IUU fishing only when the Chinese fishing fleet is near their territorial waters. Otherwise, it's not considered a significant issue for public attention. So achieving sustainable security requires consistent allocation of resources over time and engagement from all parties and agencies involved in environmental protection. State policies should ensure budget continuity and facilitate interagency cooperation. And in addition, the armed and security forces have to implement strategic communication to promote environmental protection on national public agendas. making citizens and policymakers aware of the negative impacts of illicit traffic of natural resources. The third element in the strategy could be capacity building and adopting new technologies. Technological development changes illicit markets and policy to deal with them. So today, the smuggling of endangered species is just a click away. And social networks facilitate interconnection between buyers and sellers. Cryptocurrency and the dark web have also incentivized illicit activities. So it's necessary to invest in training security forces to deal effectively with this kind of crime. Implementing new technology like blockchain, AI, and drones could significantly improve efforts in monitoring and surveillance and enforcement capabilities. It's also important to implement an innovation culture that encourages exchange of ideas and collaboration across various sectors, including the military, academia, scientists, and entrepreneurs. Finally, the fourth strategic guideline should focus on international cooperation. There are several agreements and initiatives for cooperation among military and law enforcement agencies for environmental protection in the region. Interpol's Environmental Crime Program and the ACTA, so the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization, are some good examples. Many countries in the Americas also engage in multinational humanitarian aid and disaster relief exercises like Panamax. However, there are still significant challenges for better cooperation. The case of IUU fishing is an excellent example of the need to continue advancing in a more sustainable legal framework to deal with this kind of environmental crime. Unregulated access to flags of convenience, transshipment, and ports with lax control exacerbate the problem and facilitate the cover-up of this activity. So, and if we analyzed the very concept of IUU fishing, so that means illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, we realize that it's such an elastic category that it becomes ambiguous. So this broad categorization encompasses three distinct types of fishing under the single legal umbrella, making policy formulation challenging. To conclude, in their dual role in environmental protection, the armed and security forces must adopt a comprehensive and multi-dimensional approach that prioritizes interagency cooperation and considers the economic, political, legal, cultural, and social aspects involved. Implementing collaborative and stable state policies and strategic communication is essential to raise environmental protection awareness. And finally, the technological progress offers innovative solutions for enhancing surveillance and enforcement efforts, while collaboration between armed and security forces in the region is crucial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reyes. I really appreciate that focus on a real integrated approach, already seeing some strong themes about focuses on whole of government, interagency, really whole of society approaches to these issues, and trying to reorient and rebalance some of the incentive structures that are at play here. So next, it is my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Erin McPhee from the Perry Center's Small But Mighty Climate Team, whom I have the immense pleasure of learning from in my day job. Dr. McPhee is a professor of practice, political anthropologist with focuses on climate security, migration, and the reintegration of formerly armed actors. In Latin America, she's conducted extensive fieldwork in Colombia, Mexico, and El Salvador among formerly armed actors, and currently has active research projects in 12 countries on these issues. I can never keep up with her. In addition, she's the founder and president of the Coriolis Institute, earned her doctorate from the University of Chicago. Dr. McPhee, can you speak a little bit to your perspective on these issues, especially with peace and security building approaches? And what lessons has your experience working with formerly armed actors lent for how we can understand these roles, among other comments that you may have?
Great. Thank you so much, Max, for the generous introduction, and to SAIS, the Wilson Center, and my home, the Perry Center, for the opportunity to speak here today, as well as my colleagues here who made my job very easy by providing some great material to start the conversation today. I think I'll just start by saying I think this panel is quite illustrative of what happens when we talk about climate security and climate change, which is that it sits at the nexus of so many different dynamics. So when we're talking about climate change, we're not just talking about environmental degradation or increasing greenhouse gases. We're talking about the intersection of economic issues, of social affairs, and as we're mentioning here, the security apparatus as well. So since we've talked a little bit or heard a little bit already about environmental crime and the relationship to organized crime and transnational organized criminal networks, I won't dwell on that too much. I will just add a couple of small pieces as well to complement what my colleagues have already discussed. The first is that I think, well, corruption was already raised, so corruption and impunity can do a lot to sort of facilitate and obfuscate the environmental crime that's occurring in a very systematic way in a lot of the countries that we find ourselves working in. And also it has served as a means for diversification for the organized criminal networks or the non-state armed groups. So that could be for a variety of reasons that they feel compelled to do so. One is, that is the first rule of investing, is diversify your assets. But in reality, the more effective the counter-narcotics strategies become, the more these non-state armed groups or transnational organized criminal groups will feel compelled to look for other sources of revenues. And that's when things like illegal gold mining or trafficking of endangered species becomes all the more incentivizing for them, especially because you have the issues of tracing. And when the gold, for example, hits the international markets, who are all too ready to purchase it, it's very difficult, really impossible, to determine what the source of this gold was. So there's some thinking there about how these supply chain networks might operate in a way, together with the private sector, to improve the tracing of these materials back to their source, potentially mitigating some of the risks of illegal mining. And then also the consequences were mentioned already of these illegal activities, these activities that sustain the income for these transnational organized criminal groups, including loss of life, destruction of habitat, for example, from mercury entering the water supply and damaging the food supply, to basically indentured servitude or forced labor. So I just wanted to paint a little bit of the picture of the organized violent structures within which a lot of this environmental degradation occurs before I transition a little bit into the topic of environmental peace building and the role of security forces and the defense sector in environmental peace building. So for those who may not be familiar with the concept, environmental peace building is really looking at how to transform challenges with regards to resource access and potential conflicts over those resources into opportunities to build trust and social cohesion, potentially between organizations or factions of societies that have had prior conflicts or prior tensions between them. So why would I care about ex-combatants in this context? Well, first of all, it's a bit of a bias since it's everything that I focus on is formerly armed actors and ex-combatants. But I believe that these are critical and attended to populations in many of the countries in which we work, because they really are the foremost experts on both production of insecurity and building security once they decide to leave those lives behind. There are a lot of factors and a lot of variables that go into the extent to which they might be capable and willing to participate in security building, but presuming that there is some disposition to do so, there are no greater experts in the context in how to do that. And what can their role be specifically in environmental peace building? So I think I'll provide a few examples from the projects that I've worked on in this hemisphere to sort of illustrate some of the different dimensions as to how both formally armed actors and the security and defense sectors can contribute substantively to peace building in the context of environmental degradation, climate change, and conflicts over resources and precious materials. So the first is a Colombian community peace garden, and this was an initiative that I worked on a collective with in Caquetá, Colombia, a particularly violence-affected department in the country, and it convened families of victims of the armed conflict, of simply rural peasant farmers who were trying to find more sustainable ways of connecting to the formal economy, and former members of both the military and the non-state armed group, the FARC. Now, we didn't name it as a reconciliation initiative. There are reasons behind that I won't get into here. But what we did position it as was an environmental peace building project. And it was a hydroponics initiative that brought in the materials that the community needed. It was a community of 45 families. Eventually, 7 would take over the governance responsibilities for this project. For them to produce their own, and the first crop was tomatoes. And we also connected with the private sector in order to ensure that there would be somebody else on the next step of the supply chain to buy any of the crops that they were able to produce. So that was a coordination between the public sector, the private sector, the grassroots community, who, by the way, was the one that drove the idea for the project. We didn't arrive with the project idea, but we consulted with them to see what it was they wanted to do. And then also there's this issue of community policing, which Dr. Levy began to sort of hint at a little bit. And so bringing in the local security forces to not only begin to build a relationship with the community that was much more positive than the legacies of state violence with which they'd become very familiar with, but also to protect the resources that they were trying to produce and help preserve their security so that they could transport those resources to market. So that was one initiative, and that's one way that at the local level, security forces or public forces can become involved. I think the issue of mission creep is very important, and that it would directly undermine efforts in multiple domains if you are to simply assign military or public forces to every initiative that comes along that has to do with environmental protection. But certainly when you're talking about guaranteeing the security of a particular community and of their transport of goods to market, that does seem like a good fit for the roles and the capabilities that the public forces already have. So certainly bearing in mind that mission creep concern is important. Another would be looking at environmental security and peace building as an opportunity or a space for regional collaboration. And this can be in terms of technological capabilities. So drone monitoring, for example, I think you began to speak about this as well. Drone monitoring or satellite imagery of some of the borderlands between multiple countries that are suffering from illegal gold mining or illegal deforestation, and combining technological and financial and security capabilities in order to build regional strengths to combat some of the activities of these organized criminal networks. That is also a role that security forces can play, not just in environmental management, but also in stabilizing some of these communities and repairing some of the damage that they've incurred as a result, not just ecologically, but also of the insecurity that these criminal groups and these organized actors have in their domains. I would add one caveat to that, is that we have seen certain cases in which indigenous groups or campesino populations do become criminalized in the process. So it's quite important that proper capacity building and training does occur with defense and security officials and forces so that they understand the nuanced nature of the problem in their context and understand who the advocates are and who the people are that are working to protect these resources and not criminalizing them along the way. That's certainly not, that's a very broad brush statement, but it is a tendency that requires some attention in order to avoid in each context. And then I think just in general, sort of tied to that, would be the issues of protection and enforcement. So there are certainly ample cases in which there are fantastic laws in place for environmental protection, either at the national level or at the state level, but they're simply not, they never leave the paper that they're written on, right? So then there's an issue with, are there enough resources and capabilities, you know, in the more marginalized areas? I'm tempted to try not to use the word peripheral because that can often do damage when they're constantly understood as peripheral, but some of the more rural areas of countries, do they have the capabilities and the human capital required to actually govern and enforce the laws that have already been developed or the compacts that the states have already signed on to? So that's certainly an issue as well. So just sort of to summarize, there are really 5 areas that I think that defense and security officials and forces should have a role in terms of environmental peace building and protection of resources. The first would be sort of the last one I was speaking of, which is resource management and safeguarding the security of the communities who are most dependent on these resources. The second would be also disaster response and recovery, which I hadn't mentioned previously, but certainly the prevention is far less costly than the cost of disaster response, but nevertheless they will still occur, and so the armed forces do need to be properly trained, equipped, and prepared so that they can respond to those incidents. The third would be conflict prevention and resolution, and I think this extends beyond the use of force, and this could be more within the domain of community policing in terms of thinking about alternatives such as transitional and restorative justice mechanisms, conflict resolution capabilities, building among both the civilian population as well as the public forces that serve them to sort of reduce the risk of armed violence to begin with, or facilitate the reintegration of the formerly armed actors who might otherwise be tempted to rearm should they feel ostracized or stigmatized or otherwise excluded from even the possibility of participating in peaceful coexistence with their receiving communities. Finally, infrastructure development and capacity building. Certainly in the example of areas where there are persistent alternating droughts and floods, infrastructure concerns are paramount. And there are many swaths of the countryside and the countries that we work in that have never been connected to the market centers or the market hubs of their countries. And so thinking about sustainable infrastructure, certainly the Army Corps of Engineers type work that they do, that also does fit within existing missions and can be critical for maintaining connectivity of these communities, not just to markets more broadly, but also to critical basic services like education and healthcare, even in the times of disaster or flooding along those lines. So thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Erin, for that fascinating intervention. Just want to open the floor and also open the Q&A session. If anyone has any questions, please find the microphones on the side. I can kick things off with an opening question, and then if anyone else has some reactions to some of the other comments, please jump in. I think we were all in the session preceding this with President Ali with a very clear call for considering the value of the assets under discussion here. And curious for your takes, you've outlined, but with a caveat, kind of not just on the concept of the argument, which was very powerful, but thinking about priorities and kind of with such a complex mix of issues at stake, how would you think about really responding to that broad call from a US, European, wealthy country perspective of protecting these assets in terms of priorities? And I mean, heard a little bit, I think across the board, we talked about legal gaps and enforcement, but just curious for your takes on priorities in that sense.
Yeah, I can start. So thank you for the question. So, in that sense, I want to focus on an important perspective revolves around sustainable security. So instead of natural security, I want to focus on another steps, no? Thinking about the sustainable security that prioritize long-term solutions and address the root causes of conflict and threats. Rather than depending only on short-term military actions or response. That is why it's essential to consider many factors involved, including environmental sustainability, social justice, economic development, and political stability. No? So we need to recognize the interconnection between healthy ecosystems and human security, understanding also that environmental degradation and resource scarcity can exacerbate conflicts and instability. No? So achieving sustainable security requires state policies. For me, it's very important. So because that consistently allocate resources over time and facilitate the interagency cooperation to reach the enduring peace and prosperity. So.
Thank you for the question. And I suppose it's not acceptable to say that everything is a top priority, but so I guess I'll pick three. One in particular related to the topic of the panel. I think modernization of military capabilities throughout the region is critical in terms of monitoring, tracking, and enforcing like I said, the existing laws and initiatives that are already in place, but maybe lack the capabilities, or both the technical and human capabilities. So modernization, as well as training in the region, I think would be among the top three priorities that I have here. The second would be tackling corruption. I think that just remains as the foundation of stabilization, security building, and violence reduction in the region. It's paralyzing when you have all of these layers of corruption that really dilute any arrival of assets or aid or initiatives or political will along the way. So I think tackling corruption remains a key priority in this area, as it does in so many others related to security in the region. And then finally, I would say regional collaboration among the different countries who are affected by these dynamics. In particular, I'm thinking of how disproportionately, for example, the Caribbean nations are affected by climate change while having had so little to do with the production of the greenhouse gases and the other elements that have contributed to the acceleration of climate change effects. So I think that regional partnerships, technological transfers, knowledge exchanges, because climate change and environmental degradation knows no national boundaries. So I believe that that should then be the basis for the way in which different countries and partners bilaterally or multilaterally work together in order to address the solutions.
Yeah, I'll just add, that I think it's often important to think about prioritizing a focus on resource neutral interventions, particularly when you have gaps in the ability of, say, a government's executive branch from its legislative branch or judicial branch to be able to actually implement certain new policies or certain legislation. And so I think with those resource neutral interventions, things like knowledge exchanges and transfer, training, capacity building, cooperation, at the foremost, I think, have to start with a mindset shift that these are important things and that they are part of it. And so it's changing the conversation, which takes time. I think we've come a long way in talking about climate security as security and moving away from threat multiplier language into just this is an imperative that must be addressed and integrated into all planning. And so once you have that mindset shift, I think at that point you can think about the legislation and legal authorities catching up in terms of the real specific changes that you need to see for particular agencies to be able to actually enforce or prosecute or share information or go after a particular incident or issue. And so I think it's a slow process, but I'm encouraged by what we're seeing in this hemisphere and globally.
Thank you very much. Do we have a question up there?
Yeah, I think.
Yes.
Sorry, I took it out. First of all, thank you so much for coming. My name is Diana Paz Garcia. I work at the Brookings Institution. As you all mentioned, environmental crime is increasingly an intrinsic part of the business model of organized crime groups all around the region, but I'm particularly thinking of the two biggest Mexican cartels, Sinaloa and Nueva Generación. So I was wondering if you could share with us two strategies for the U.S. to further integrate natural security in the strategy to combat them, and particularly as we're increasingly seeing them co-opting agricultural legal economies like avocados, fisheries, limes, and what is the role in the U.S. when it comes to this new integration of environmental degradation? Thank you.
I can start. Yes, this is something that we work on a lot. It takes up a lot of our time. You know, there's different layers of tools that we have. So the United States has unilateral legal authorities that have been given to us to try to work on enforcement matters. So we have, for example, the Pele Amendment to the Fishermen's Protective Act of 1967, which presidentially we certified Mexico nationals of Mexico last year as undermining the CITES, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species, as a result of trade in Totoaba and the effects on the most endangered porpoise, the vaquita, in the Gulf of California. That's a unilateral tool that we have in our legislative toolbox to think about. We talked about penalties, we talked about incentive structures, and so as one of the largest market economies, we have to think about what can we do from a unilateral standpoint if necessary, and if it gets to that point, in order to try to drive change. Ideally, we want to work bilaterally, and we have bilateral tools. And so we have our U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA agreement, and within each of our free trade agreements, we have our environmental chapters. So our Chapter 24 negotiations are key, and how we try to approach these issues. And so we try to build in that bilateral, and then with Canada, trilateral structures. And then multilaterally and at the international organization scale, we have the actual treaty bodies and conventions that we comply with. And so quite recently, actually, both Mexico and the United States recently completed our visits from the CITES Secretary General and Secretariat mission to think about our progress there. And so what I think we're looking at is just different levels of approaches, different levels of this overall strategy for the same goal. We want to drive down demand, we want to drive down this activity, we want to support law enforcement and anti-corruption activities, we want to ensure that there is appropriate intelligence sharing and that the Mexican Navy has what it needs, and how can we better cooperate. These take efforts on both sides to be successful. It's also highly interlinked to our efforts in terms of border security and how we resource border security. And I think there is perhaps a lack of awareness of just the roles that a lot of our domestic agencies have in this scheme. We have the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Patrol, but we also have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and our wildlife inspectors and our law enforcement officers and NOAA's Office of Law Enforcement as well. And so we have these additional agencies that are, if you think, CBP gets under-resourced, I mean, these agencies really do get short shrift sometimes in terms of the resourcing they have and the impact that they can have, because they work very effectively and very efficiently in this interagency construct together. So I'm really heartened and encouraged by the work that we've seen, but I continue to highlight that we have to see, it takes everyone and it takes all of the agencies, and sometimes these gaps that we see, the legal authorities, they don't catch up on each side of the border or in each context. And so sometimes you need to think really creatively about how you apply the solutions. Someone noted to me recently, Al Capone didn't go to jail for all of his crimes. He went to jail for tax evasion. And so how do you think creatively on the judicial and prosecution side as well is really critical to how we tackle these problems.
Thank you very much for the question, and also I learned a lot from that, so thank you. It's my favorite part of panels. So I think I might add sort of a compliment, which would be something along the lines of, what might an agency like USAID also be able to do in this context? And I'll share very briefly just a quick vignette. There's a fishing community that I have worked in Baja California Sur in Mexico that had spent 15 years on ecological restoration initiatives, only to be taken over by the cartels during COVID because the cartels were looking more inward as they were struggling to get all of their narcotics outward across the borders that were closed. And they occupied this small fishing village who had over, actually it was about 12 or 13 years, learned and practiced sustainable oyster harvesting methods, but then found themselves reverting to very unsustainable methods in order to compensate for the revenues that they were losing, which were being taken by the cartels, which was about 50%. So when I arrived at this community, they had already had in place their plans in order to return back to more sustainable practices, which was a collaboration with neighboring communities. And I think what that instance really showed to me, as well as some of the other very small fishing communities that I've worked with on the Mexican coast, is that what the United States could also be served by is going in and learning a bit more about what already works in the context, what's already happening there, and creating the space and the capabilities, the infrastructure and the resources in order to scale some of these quite successful initiatives in small fishing villages, but that just don't simply have the capabilities or are not legible to institutions like USAID on a regular basis. So I think a bit more fact-finding and exploratory work on what some of these communities already have in place could be also a useful approach to thinking about how we might productively intervene and support these issues in context. Thanks.
Thank you, Erin. I sincerely apologize. We're going to have to wrap this panel up now so that we can get to our final keynote of the day. Please join me in welcoming this, in thanking, this fantastic panel. Thank you so much. So we'll just take a quick break now and then return to the auditorium for the keynote. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us for our last session. Before we get started, just some quick administrative notes. For those of you joining us over Zoom, we do provide simultaneous interpretation. All you have to do is click the globe icon on the bottom part of the screen. Para los que están participando a través de Zoom, sí estamos ofreciendo interpretación simultánea. Lo único que tiene que hacer es apretar el icono del globo del mundo en la parte inferior de la pantalla. Also, we will be doing a Q&A session. And so we have two mics set up, one on the front left of the auditorium and another one halfway down or halfway up on the right-hand side. Okay, so it is my pleasure today to host the keynote speech. We have Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, who is the former Minister of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica and is now the CEO and chairperson of the Global Environment Facility. He's joining us today to share his thoughts and his experience, both from being minister, but also from his work at the Global Environment Facility, which is pretty groundbreaking in many respects. And so I think what we'd like to do is maybe just start off with a conversation. Just generally, we've had 3 amazing panels and also a great presidential address from the president of Guyana, all tackling really the issues of deforestation, illegal fishing, and then in our third panel, which we're all just listening to, talking about the role of the armed forces and law enforcement in addressing these phenomena. But what I would like to maybe get your thoughts on a little bit, start off on deforestation. And you and I had talked briefly about some of these incentives. 84% is happening illicitly, but in one of the earlier panels today, they said, it's actually, we can achieve a tipping point where people transition into the illicit deforestation to more legal forms, entering legality in sustainable manners. And so I wanted to kind of get your thoughts from your experience. How is that achievable? How can countries address this using their institutions? It's right here.
Thanks, Jim, and it's a great pleasure to be here today in the closing of this very interesting event. If we use a forest cover baseline of probably 150 years, because forest cover has been changing through the millennia, but we use a baseline based on the very first reports on forest cover and a lot of scientific evidence, but we can say that we have lost 1/3 of the forests in the planet. And the forests in the planet are not just located in the tropics. We got temperate forests and we got boreal forests. Overall, we have lost 1/3 of the forest. Another third is highly degraded or intervened. And just 1/3 of the regional forest continues to be primary forest. That's one very important fact. The second element that I want to share here is that deforestation is a negative externality of our unsustainable, irrational economic systems that aims for unlimited growth without recognizing planetary boundaries. The third element that I want to share with you all is that, deforestation happens at a very small scale, 1 hectare, a small farmer in the middle of the Amazon, or a large transnational corporation. Deforestation happens when the owner of the land or the tenant of the land does a very simple cost-benefit analysis. What is the benefit to keep these forests, and what are the options of transforming this farm from forest into cattle or agriculture? It's a very simple economic assessment. And based on the fact that there is no ways in our neoclassic economic model to fully internalize the value of forests, standing forests, and environmental services, well, the typical decision is to cut down the forest and generate another activity, because keeping the forest doesn't generate any value to the small, medium, and large owners, even though the environmental services that forest provides is of high value at the regional, national, and global level. So we see here a huge market failure that is unable to fully reflect and internalize the benefits that forest generates to the local economy and to the global economy. There's a huge market failure, and that has to do with this neoclassic economic model that doesn't reflects the values of nature and many other different values in our society. The fourth element that I want to bring to the attention here is that for us, the experts in forests, for us, the expert on sustainability, it is illogical, even irrational, to talk about legal or illegal deforestation. Deforestation is deforestation. And scientists have told us that legal or illegal, it is bad. It's bad for the people, it's bad for the nature, and bad for the economies. We got, the numbers tell us that 80% of deforestation is illegal. Yes, that is correct. But that is very simple. That is because the owner of the land didn't comply with the tramit, and the forest agency didn't do the paperwork. Probably there is no local forest, National Forest Service agency right there. So it is something very little compared to other environmental crimes. So for me, the discussion should be, how do we concentrate to keep that 1/3 of primary forests in planet Earth, and how do we restore the rest? Because in most of the places where forest is or was, those soils are not good for food production. So there's a high potential to restore and high potential to preserve, providing us that safety benefits against climate change, loss of biodiversity, and all the irrational elements that we humans do. My fifth element, and I can go to probably 20 elements, but I will stop here in my fifth, is that deforestation, as is the case with climate change and pollution, is no less than the best example of policy incoherence at the country level. Because if you see how our societies has organized themselves in this social contract, we establish, executive, legislative, judicial system, but in the executive, which is where I have been working for, most of my career, I've seen, a big contradiction. On one side, we created agencies with a mandate to protect and sustainably use nature, and on the other side, we keep agencies to continue business as usual. Business as usual is, agriculture, is mining, is energy. And this business as usual do have more political power. I mean, Jim, who has more political power in a government, a minister of finance, a minister of energy, or a minister of environment? I mean, that's a simple question. So the governments keep on investing much resources in activity that destroy nature than what they invest in those agencies that has an explicit social, political mandate to protect nature. This is the best example of political incoherence. Today, we do the numbers. The GEF, the Global Environment Facility, works on finances and finances on environment. Today, all countries in the world invest 144 times more resources invested in activities that generate deforestation than what they invest in protecting nature. So at the end of the day, deforestation is not an issue of there is not enough money or there is no money. At the end of the day, it is not an issue of we don't have the technology, we don't have the means. It is an issue of political issue. It's a political issue. So my country, Costa Rica, is a very different example of what we normally see in those countries with high deforestation rates, because the country has learned how to deal with the two big problems associated to deforestation. I mentioned the market failure, and then there's this other, the institutional failure that generates this lack of policy coherence. So in Costa Rica, we did a couple of things. By the way, Costa Rica is the only developing country that has been able to stop deforestation, double the size of the forest, while the economy tripled and the population doubled. Costa Rica is a country that doesn't have a conflict of where do we protect forests, where do we generate our food, where do we generate our energy, where do we live. And this is not because we are very good at planning. We are not Germans or Norwegians. We are guys from the tropics that have learned the hard way on how to connect the dots. And yes, it's a very stable society without an army, something which is relevant in the context of today's conversations, without an army that has understood that nature can be a good source of job and economic growth. So the point is that in Costa Rica, we did two things which are very important dealing with these two failures. One is that we transform the institutional setting in the executive branch, whereby we don't have 3 or 4 agencies managing natural resources, all of them with different visions and having conflicts. So the Minister of Environment in Costa Rica is the Minister of Energy, Mines, Water, Oceans, Biodiversity, and Nature Conservation. And when I was a minister in Costa Rica, I attended meetings, regional meetings, as an example of the institutional failure. I'll give you share an anecdote here with the audience. you know, as a Minister of Energy, myself in Costa Rica, I attended meetings of ministers of energy of Latin America. And I remember the first time I went to a meeting of ministers of energy of Latin America, where we were there, you know, 30 ministers of energy. And when we were introducing ourselves, I introduced myself as the Minister of Environment of Costa Rica. And there was dead silence in the room. And everybody was looking like this, and the chair of the meeting, the Minister of Energy of Argentina, said, Mr. Rodriguez, you are in the wrong meeting because this is a meeting of ministers of energy. And well, I was forced to explain myself that in Costa Rica, the Minister of Environment is also the Minister of Energy, because in Costa Rica, we don't make a difference on how we manage renewable and non-renewable natural resources. This is the way by which we've been addressing the institutional failure. So I explained myself why I was there, and they didn't like my explanation. They felt that I was a spy, an enemy, or something weird, because I was not a pure, 100% pure blood Minister of Energy. And by the way, that was 2018, they only talk about oil and gas. This is what the ministers of Latin America was talking in their regional meeting, oil and gas. And I was the only one talking about renewables and, you know, phasing out subsidies and phasing out coal and gas and, you know, fossil fuels. So how come, I asked myself, we're going to achieve the global targets with this institutional setting that continues to promote silos, sectoral policies, and promote policy incoherence? On the other side, with the market failure, what we did in Costa Rica was to put a tax on carbon, on fossil fuels. With that, we reflect the benefit of offsetting carbon services. So we put a tax on fossil fuels, so the one who pollutes pays for that, and the resources goes through a forest fund to pay private owners of forests for the services of offsetting that carbon emission. So if you pay them for the carbon services, at least the cost of opportunity of doing cattle ranching, guess what? They will aim for that. So they will protect and restore the forest instead of promoting and expanding the agricultural frontier for cattle ranching and other economic activities, because the payment for carbon offsetting is more attractive than the other economic options. So this is a kind of a quick reaction, James, to your questions about deforestation, how we deal with it.
Oh, no, thank you very much, and really appreciate that. And so, you know, I really like the issue of deforestation, and I know you've done a lot of work all throughout the region as well, working with the Global Environment Facility. So when we're looking at countries that have a lack of state presence, for example, Colombia specifically, what comes to mind, I know we addressed that in the last panel. You know, how can you influence, you know, those institutional failures specifically, and then market failures in addressing deforestation? I mean, in Colombia specifically, since the 2016 Peace Accord, deforestation rates have climbed. And so now Colombia, for the first time, is really facing deforestation levels that never had to since 2016.
Yeah. Right after the peace agreement in Colombia in 2016, there was a fiscal reform in 2017 where they put a tax on carbon. But they were not able to use that mechanism the way that Costa Rica has been using, channeling those resources in these, you know, post-conflict areas, whereby, because in Colombia what is happening is in these post-conflict areas, now this is the areas for lawless areas where the illegal mining and the illegal logging and the land grabbing, big time land grabbing is happening. Before there were no land grabbing because the guerrillas were there. So as peace comes in, they were unable to do, I will say, in a very respectful manner, really strategically channel their resources coming from the tax on carbon to those frontier areas. The second element is to heavily invest in land tenure and rights, because that's the other big issue associated in Colombia. And I will say the third element is that it won't be from Bogota that you will resolve things. It's strengthening the local government, and particularly at the district level, where you can address these issues because people are sensitive to the impact of deforestation, and they have seen the economic and social impacts of that land use. So I think that we need to accept that there should be a new paradigm on how we engage at the subnational level. And this is something that the GEF now is looking with a lot of attention because we work basically with the national governments, with the executive branch, with the Minister of Environment. And now the GEF, as we look into the near future, we're going to explore possibilities to really channel financial resources directly at the subnational level without going through the capital for the blessing on, you put money there. And you know how it works. So that element will empower those who are in the front lines of deforestation to deal with that. And I think that we need to test this in ways that, can allow us to think that this can be a way by which we can stop, but most importantly, do an investment that is sustainable in time.
So one question, and I'm asking this more because it wasn't necessarily addressed too much, but I know I have a student of mine that's specifically working on this topic, which is carbon markets. And she was doing a lot of research on carbon markets, and we just recently did our capstone to Colombia, and she was asking about carbon markets. And what was interesting is there was, what she learned was there's a lot of resistance to it, just because these new initiatives to try to create carbon markets are usually not taking into account indigenous rights, rural communities, and usually they're the ones that are being given money. A leader in a community is given money, but it's not being managed in a very correct manner. And so there was a lot of resistance to that topic when we were in Colombia. So I'm asking this more for her so she can complete her research. But I would love to get your thoughts on this.
Well, a few things on this one because I've been working a lot. First, indigenous group and local communities are skeptic of the carbon markets, not because of the financial tool, rather than the fact that they don't trust in governments for very good historical reasons. So the only way that you can really address that issue is solving the land tenure and the right issue. I mean, in most of our Latin American countries, there are no policies and legal frameworks related to who owns the carbon stocks, who owns the biochemical and genetic resources of biodiversity. There are laws that address the issue of who is the owner of the biological resource, but not much than that. And then there's the issue of access and benefit sharing, which is something that's still very abstract, even though there is the Nagoya Protocol, and many countries has approved it. They haven't been able to pass national legislation that implements the Nagoya Protocol that has to do with access and benefit sharing. That's one element. The second element is that what we have is a voluntary carbon market. Voluntary, I'm a lawyer. I went to law school, and I understand very well what voluntary means. It means if you want to do it, you do it, or if you don't want to do it, don't do it. Even though Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement establishes a mandate for a legally binding system of carbon offsets at the national and international level, parties in the Climate Convention hasn't agreed on how that should be regulated and implemented. And we're still dragging our feet with regards to this one. So we need to go from a voluntary system into a binding mechanism that guarantees that everybody will offset their emission, and eventually it's not an issue of offsetting your footprint rather than be neutral. And this is what we need to go there. And my third element is that Costa Rica was the country who put this concept at the beginning. In 1997, we put the tax on fossil fuels, and we began the payments, and we saw that a positive incentives at the same time that we were phasing out perverse incentives and subsidies that were harmful for forest conservation, We went from negative incentives, it took us 2 decades, to positive incentives, and people reacted very positively because, the people like an income, and if you protect your forest, you'll be paid for that. They like the idea because it's less labor intense than having cows or whatever else. But the problem is that there's a golden rule that hasn't been applied because this is a voluntary market, which has to do with the price. And the price of a ton of forest carbon should be at least at the level of the opportunity cost of doing cattle ranching. Today, the price of carbon is between $5 and $7 per ton. In my country, Costa Rica, it costs $18 to offset a ton of carbon. So there is no incentive for us to engage with companies and governments or individuals to do carbon offsetting if the cost of offsetting is higher than the price. So I believe that the big burden in terms of really mainstreaming carbon credits transactions at the level and scale that we needed cannot be accomplished if the price continues to be way below the cost of generating that service. And this is something that hasn't been understood that well, particularly by those who are on the demand side. This has forced many countries, particularly countries which we call themselves high forest, low deforestation nations. And today, you heard the president of a high forest, low deforestation nation making, I will say, very compelling arguments. There's probably 40 countries which we call them high forest, low deforestation nations, which are extremely frustrated. Probably you heard the president of Guyana expressing his frustration that Guyana has been for 20 years keeping, 16 million hectares of primary Amazonian forests intact without anybody paying for those services. And the high forest, low deforestation nations, it will be a future cartel. They will make a cartel and organize themselves because without their carbon stocks and their carbon benefits, we will never achieve the 1.5 degrees target in the climate convention. So they will organize themselves and push the price towards something that is logic. And these are my 3 points on carbon markets.
Oh, thank you very much. So I'd like to transition a little into IUU fishing, and I believe you've done a little bit of work on that as well, and just wanted to get some of your thoughts on how countries can address IUU fishing, especially given the limited capabilities they have for monitoring.
Well, here in the ocean, the market and the institutional failure is even bigger than what we see in the land, where we are addressing the forest and the biodiversity issue. As a matter of fact, it's very different the way humans behave in the land than in the ocean. I mean, in the ocean, we behave like people used to behave in the land 13, 20,000 years ago, because in the ocean, we are hunters and gatherers. In the land, we produce our food, we domesticated species, and we do things probably not in a sustainable way, but a very different way. And I will say that the way we manage our oceans are very primitive. For us, it's not a surprise that we have lost 90% of the big predators of the oceans. And the oceans are, a dump site for all kinds of human activities. So yes, we got a huge market failure there. And then the institutional failure is even bigger. We have fishing agencies that look more like a mining institution than a sustainable management resource organization. Fishing agencies continues to be under the political supervision of the ministers of agriculture, and agriculture has proven not to be the most keen executive branch organization in terms of sustainability. 80% of global deforestation, particularly in the tropics, is generated because of policies that are coming from the ministries of agriculture. And in my days as a minister of environment, my biggest challenge by far was the minister of agriculture and here in his traditional approaches to issues. So it's not a surprise that fishing agencies under agriculture are way behind in terms of our aspiration of sustainability. That's one element. So the institutional failure is big time on the ocean. The market failure is even bigger on the ocean. And then we have a third element, which is, on land, we humans had agreed on a kind of an environmental pact. We have agreed on creating protected areas. We have agreed on, there's a lot of gaps and challenges. But there's something there that works or is the basis for sustainability, which are policies, institutions that are helping manage the land in certain order, where we will be producing our food, energy, cities, et cetera, et cetera. In the ocean, there's nothing there. There is no spatial planning. There is no coordination across sectors. And the only ones that has imposed their muscle is the fishing sector, particularly industrial and semi-industrial sectors. So I will say that in the oceans, we are probably 50 years behind what we have done, and you just see the facts. Let's see protected areas. In the land, we had probably 17, 20% of the land protected. In the ocean is less than 10%. Nevertheless, there are great commitments based on a new biodiversity framework, global biodiversity framework that we all agree, where countries has committed to protect 30% of the ocean and 30% of the land by 2030. I'm still hearing ideas on countries on how to do that. And countries approach this as, oh my goodness, well, this is the cost of, saving the planet. They don't understand that this is the best option in terms of cost effectiveness to deal with the issues, because the scientific community has been telling us if we don't protect 30% of the planet, we'll be confronting the worst of this potential ecological meltdown of the systems that maintains life in the planet. So I will say that the homework to be done is huge. So illegal, unregulated, unreported activities is a minor issue compared to the big challenge that we have in the ocean, which should be addressed through a new institutional framework dealing with the market failure. And yes, we need to support countries with regards to marine spatial planning and organizing. So this is within the exclusive economic zones, which is like, 30% of the oceans. The rest are the high seas. And when you go into the high seas, illegal, unregulated, whatever, that doesn't apply at all, because there is no jurisdiction applies to that. And, first come, first serve. And this is what has happened in the high seas. The good news is that last year, there was a UN agreement to protect biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. The JEF has been selected as the financial mechanism, so we are going to mobilize millions of dollars in this first stage, 2 countries, so they can ratify, this is the first step, ratify the convention, and then begin implementing the convention. And this will be very interesting because it will be the high seas is a global commons. So then there's a need for a global commons approach to what we should be doing over there. And I think that the first thing that we will be seeing in the high seas are 2 things. One is the issue of deep sea mining, and there's another stream of political negotiations dealing with that one, and the other is the creation of marine protected areas in the high seas.
Thank you, I appreciate that. So let me just pivot to what our last panel was, which is, is there a role that you see for law enforcement and armed forces in addressing deforestation, IUU fishing? I think there have been many attempts. Some have been really more successful than others. I think IBAMA is a great example in Brazil of a successful model, several years back, but also I think they've been rather effective over the last year in reducing some of the deforestation in Brazil. And so would like to get some of your thoughts and what are some of those best practices?
Well, thank you, Jim, for that question. I'm an environmental lawyer. I work in environmental law many of my years. So a few things here which are very important to address, yes, we need armed forces and security forces helping the environmental enforcement, and we need to really begin addressing this issue by bringing the conversation on the environmental rule of law. How do we implement the environmental rule of law? What are the conditions for the countries to address this issue? And this conversation is not happening. Besides probably the environmental law centers, which is small groups of like-minded lawyers trying to do policy advocacy and many other things, but that doesn't go beyond that, or probably beyond the academics rooms. So this should be a high political priority. If you address the issue of, if you address these issues under an aspiration to really implement the environmental laws, you would begin with the right approach. The second element that I think it is extremely important is that the full implementation and verification of the environmental laws has to do with two actions. And we basically concentrate on one, which is the regulation, the command and regulation, the norms, the punitive laws. But if you create the right market conditions, there won't be as much environmental crimes. Because in many cases, environmental crimes are due to a social need. So if you create a good balance, you need to design this. And you need to approach this under these overarching, the environmental rule of law approaches. You can really deal with many of these issues if the market takes care of many of these illegal crimes. As an environmental lawyer myself, I think that, yes, there is a huge need for creating capacities on the enforcement. And here's where I want to highlight some huge gaps that we have at the country level. Many of the Latin American, Caribbean countries invest a lot of their budget in defense, and they got all kind of, defense investments here, the Army, the frontier police, the regular police, the migratory police, the fiscal police. I mean, you got the municipal police, you got many forces, all of them being, trained and invested in. But the park rangers, those who has the responsibility to police biodiversity in protected areas, are not considered a special police force. And even worse than that, I will say that half of the Latin American countries, park rangers, doesn't even have police authority. They don't have the possibility to wear a gun and to do anti-poaching missions and activities. If they are in the middle of the jungle and they find some poachers and hunters, they cannot detain them. They need to go they need to walk 2 days, go to the nearest police station, convince these guys to walk 2 days and try to find those poachers. I mean, that doesn't work at all. So we need to set some very good baselines and begin setting standards in terms of the professionalization of the police. When I was a minister in 2018, 2019, I knocked the door of the US government and I told them, you're training the Costa Rican special police forces for drugs, for immigration, for this. The Rangers are a specialized force. So I engaged with the US government in training, in building capacities, in equipping them. And now if you go to a national park and you see the anti-poaching rangers unit, and you see them, you don't see a difference with a well-trained police, regular police. And this has made a big, big difference. The other element that we need to bring into this conversation is how we narrow the gap within the technology and the data. I mean, there's a lot of very good technology that is being used by regular defense forces or regular police that is not getting to the rangers, those who are in the front line of the environmental crimes. So from the fact that a ranger doesn't have police authority all the way up to the highest institutional level failures. We need a comprehensive approach. We need to address this issue at the regional level, and we need to set some very basic standards so they can become a real professional force. Otherwise, we'll keep on dealing with the big problems that we have today.
Thank you very much. And so we only have a couple more minutes left. So I just wanted to open it up for anybody that might have some questions.
We'll see if this works. Oh, great. That's fantastic. Maybe more of a reaction than a question if I can contribute to the conversation. I'm Kevin Connell. I'm a Coast Guard officer, again, in disguise, since I don't have my uniform on. I just wanted to highlight the partnership I feel that we have had between the U.S. Coast Guard and the Costa Rican Coast Guard is truly a role model for how security cooperation programs can be really effective. You know, there's a couple of aspects to it. One, we've transferred, the U.S. has transferred some previous U.S. Coast Guard cutters, patrol boats, to the Costa Rican Coast Guard. On top of that, over the past several years, we've had 3 maritime advisors that are in country, 2 of which are embedded in with the Costa Rican Coast Guard as curriculum advisors. So they're supporting through train-the-trainer type programs on a daily basis how to establish effective maintenance and operations programs which build on our strategic framework through bilateral agreements, at-sea operations, and now through in-country, person-to-person, every single day of the year interactions and engagements to really operationalize the thought of working together at sea to counteract some of the illicit maritime activity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for your comment. And yeah, I know that case very well. I fully agree that this is a very successful partnership within the U.S. government, in this case, the Coast Guard and the Costa Rican government. What we have done together is great. Not just great for the main objectives, which is illegal drugs and illegal immigration, but nature conservation. I mean, I hope that you had the opportunity to go to Cocos Island. What we have done in expanding Cocos Island, in part has to do with this partnership. And let me tell you something, Kevin, that probably you don't know, but when I was a minister, I was pushing with the Minister of Public Security to really train the Rangers with their police academy and many things. And they never support us. But it was until I went to the U.S. Embassy in San Jose, and I talked with the guy who is in command of the U.S. Coast Guard partnership, and I asked him, can you help us? And through him, I was able to bring the Costa Rican Coast Guard, because we don't have a navy, we don't have a navy, and they were the first one who really understood the need for joint effort within the environmental authorities and the Costa Rican Coast Guard, because the U.S. Coast Guard was supporting them. So I will say that this is a very good example of how that collaboration can be very fruitful. Not just because of the big issues, which are, drug trafficking and illegal immigrants, but also nature conservation. So you have been able to invest in something that now the Costa Ricans are investing in, which is expanding in our capacities to do much better in terms of enforcement, in terms of policing our waters, in terms of using the latest technology to do that. And this is, in a sense, very important to us, because the ocean is 10 times, the Costa Rican Ocean is 10 times bigger than the land mass. And we don't have any capacities to patrol and take care of this. So this is a good example. I think that for us, it was a great opportunity to learn from the U.S. Coast Guard. And for the U.S. government, it was great to work with a country that doesn't have a navy and force them to, think outside of the box. And I think that it is a very good, thank you, Kevin, it's a very good example of very productive cooperation within countries.
So we have a question right here from Benjamin Cadan.
Hi there, yeah, Benjamin Gadan from the Wilson Center. I want to hear more about the High Seas Treaty and particularly whether Latin America could be pioneers in ratification and then actually establishing in the high seas marine protected areas. I know Chile already is a country that's ratified it and has a proposal. But the question is sort of whether you see the political will that this region could be a leader in ratification, but also back to the same enforcement limitations that you've been describing, that if it's difficult already in the exclusive economic zones to be protecting areas that have been set aside for conservation, what would the region need to meaningfully protect areas in the high seas if it were in fact willing to make those commitments as part of the High Seas Treaty?
Thank you. That's a very, very nice question. First, let me say that Latin America, Central America, well, Latin America has the biggest complex of marine protected areas in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. This is Ecuador, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Panama, the largest complex of marine protected areas. And the U.S. is helping us in patrolling and helping on that one. And this is the first set of countries who really achieved the 30% before 2030. And there was a very nice log, kind of name that Colombia put to this effort, which was 30 before 30. Let's do the 30% before the 2030 deadline. So Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador and Panama has been able to achieve in paper the protection of 30% of the erosion. So that was extremely important because there was a lot of pushback from the fishing sectors, particularly in Ecuador and in Costa Rica. And today, that decision to expand those marine protected areas to cover 30% is being challenged at national courts. So that is a big issue. Most of those fleets are domestic fleets, national fleets. In the case of Ecuador, we know that Chinese and other international fleets are just outside the boundaries of the ECs. So it will be very interesting to see how countries will be dealing with that business as usual issue of the industrial fishing in the high seas. And by the way, the industrial fishing in the high seas happens because of the big subsidies that developed or host nations do have. And that is an issue that we need to address because there's a commitment in the same global framework where countries agreed to protect 30% of the ocean and the land, there's another commitment to phase out perverse incentives and subsidies that are harmful for nature by 2030. And let me tell you, that is not going to happen. Because we know that the political cost of dealing with subsidies will take us much time. Look what is happening in Europe when farmers are, complaining about the fact that subsidies will change. And that happens in Europe, that happens in Brazil, that happens in Costa Rica, everywhere. So that is a big issue, and we need to really understand how do we create a politically viable mechanism by which those incentives, the subsidies, are not harmful to biodiversity. Because the subsidies or the financial aid can be there to support the economic activities without harming nature. So using payments for environmental services may be a good way. Instead of subsidizing the price of milk, pay the farmer to increase the biomass in the farm, increasing, putting more trees that may not compete with cows and milk production. So there are ways to do that. But going to your question, at this stage, well, it took us 17 years to agree on that new treaty. 17 years it took us. Now we go to the ratification process. And I think that ratification will not have that much of a political challenge because no specific economic sector at the country level will be pushing against it. So they will be, I will say, quite agnostic into the process. It's a matter of, the foreign affairs and environment putting the proposals into the Congress and bringing civil society, academics, and others to push for that. I believe that in some cases, even ironically, landlocked nations will do the ratification before non-landlocked nations, because now landlocked nations has an interest in the ocean for the first time. And we at the JEF, we're looking at some landlocked nations like Bolivia and Paraguay, and also in Central Asia, in Africa, there's a bunch of countries. I'm trying to put together a landlocked nations coalition to speed up and put pressure on those who are not landlocked to ratify that, because we need the ratification so we can begin the full implementation of that. So in a sense, I don't have an idea of what will be the political challenges. All political challenges are linked to an economic interest. At this point, our objective is to really provide the funding for the process of ratification. And I hope that we can do this quickly in the next couple of years. Thank you.
So we have time for one final question.
Hi, my name's Heidi Smith. I have a comment and a question. My comment is that you're exactly right that about the environment and energy being together, but it was Secretary Clinton in 2011 who brought together the Partnership of the Americas together at the IDB. And so it even has a stronger, longer term, identifying the great example that Costa Rica provided and on those institutional failures that you suggested. But my question is, thank you for describing the pricing systems. My question is really about the carbon cowboy topic within the state confines. There's a lot of national declarations, and there's private companies, and there's also individuals that are providing these sequestration and saying that they're helping with the carbon. I'm interested that the GEF is now doing subnational, and at the subnational level, we're also thinking about subnational financing. But how does this national competition happen, and how does that marketplace, and how does the GEF potentially deal with it if the market isn't actually operating properly? And then also, is there any other, how do you envision this happening in the future?
Thank you for your question. That's a very tough one, and I probably don't have all answers to it. First, it's a voluntary private transactions within a buyer and a seller. This is like a seller selling bananas or coffee, and you agree with the buyer on the price. But of course, there are more elements into this transaction than just a private transaction, particularly in those countries where there's big gaps in terms of who owns the carbon stocks. Because in many of the Latin American countries, the president of Guyana was here, and even though there are, probably 40, 60, 70,000 people living in the bush, in the jungles, none of them has a title, property title. So if you don't have a property title, you are not able to participate in these transactions. This is the basic, elements of land tenure. But we can get into more specific and complex issues, particularly in who owns the carbon stocks. So I think that most of the national legislations are really old, and we need to really understand that providing rights under a private property regime system has proven to be the most effective mechanism as opposed to government-owned and driven. So, 15 years ago, I did some research on deforestation and the nexus within private property systems and government-owned land. And it was not a surprise to me to see that the countries with the highest deforestations are those who doesn't believe in a system, on a productive system based on private property. And they were given rights. And rights, to use the resources are not as important or relevant as the right of ownership. So I think that is one very important issue. Land rights, land tenure. When I see my country in the 1950s, Costa Rica decided to give land to the landless and to provide title. And from there on, the country began progressing in terms of human development, in terms of GDP, in terms of many different elements. And I think that discussion is not happening in an open manner at national congresses or in the political campaigns at all. So I don't know how we are going to achieve the 1.5 climate if 33% of the climate emissions comes from deforestation, or I don't know how we are going to implement the new global biodiversity framework if the issue of rights is still open and little progress is being done. Well, fortunately, today we got a lot of new organizations like the Land Tenure Facility and others working on these topics, but I strongly believe by political nature, I'm a liberal, and I believe in, private property and the elements associated to that. So if you create the right enabling incentives and conditions, private owners of the land will be the best stewards for them. So I believe that that's one issue. We'll have carbon cowboys and irresponsible companies, but if we are able to understand that we need to create those good enabling conditions for a market to operate, particularly the price on carbon, I will think that those issues around greenwashing and cowboys here and there will be less and less than what we see today. And probably the carbon cowboys make the headlines in the news, and very little headlines make the very successful things. I was in Madre de Dios, Peru, and in the previous panel they mentioned Madre de Dios last year, and I was impressed on how NGOs has been using the carbon credits as a very interesting way to sustainable finance the management of large landscapes in, for example, Manu National Park, which is probably one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. Those who are working on research on management of the resources are being financed by the voluntary carbon market. And that is not making the headlines, only the bad news, unfortunately.
Well, two things. First off, just a round of applause. Thank you very much. And so this concludes the forum. As Benjamin Gadan had mentioned before, this is really launching an initiative to, over the next couple of years, to do more research in partnership with the Wilson Center to keep exploring this topic. But until then, we are having a reception upstairs in the breezeway. So I please encourage everyone to go up there, enjoy some of the drinks, some of the food that's up there, and carry on with the conversation. Thank you very much.